Dear members, silence please. Before we begin, let me remind you that this meeting is being recorded and is broadcasted on the OSCPA social media platforms and website. The list of speakers for our open debate is closed. Members registered to speak are going to have interventions up to 2 minutes maximum. Thank you for understanding and cooperation. Then we go for the adoption of the agenda. A draft agenda has been circulated. Can we adopt the agenda? The agenda is adopted. Then we go to reports by ad hoc committees, and we will first hear reports from our Vice President Daniela de Ridder to report on the work of the ad hoc committee on migration. Daniela, you have the floor.
Madam President, dear colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to update you on the activities of the ad hoc committee on migration. I have also shared a written report. First of all, let me mention what we did yesterday while meeting on the ad hoc committee during this winter meeting. We referred to the situation of Syrian refugees in the OIC region mainly. Our committee was established nearly 10 years ago to tackle the policy challenges stemming from the Syrian civil war. It is only befitting that in our meeting yesterday, we placed the issue of recent developments in Syria and their impact on Syrian refugees in the OIC region on the agenda. Indeed, the fall of the Assad regime last December was a significant development that has profound consequences for the 6 million displaced Syrians, most of whom are hosted in neighboring countries such as Turkey, but also Lebanon, Jordan, Germany, and others. We also have to bear in mind that there are over 7 million internally displaced persons in Syria. Thousands have already returned, but 75% of refugees in the region have no plans to return yet. And I think this is, when we have seen the pictures of the destroyed buildings, this is obvious. We discussed the current volatile security situation in Syria, as well as the perspective to stabilization as well as returns. The key messages which our speakers conveyed were the following. First, the crisis is not over. Humanitarian and development aid are still needed. Secondly, we need to continue to support neighboring countries hosting Syrian refugees. Thirdly, the protection status of those in need must be maintained. Conditions are not in place for mass repatriation yet. Fourthly, returns must be voluntary, and I insist on that, voluntary and based on free and informed decision making. And fifthly and finally, consider enabling go and see visits, which can ensure the sustainability of returns. Let me now switch over to the upcoming field visits that we planned. Looking ahead, we are planning a visit to Madrid and the Canary Islands on 20th and 21st March. This critical visit comes amid a sharp rise in irregular migration along the North Atlantic route from West Africa. A record of 47,000 migrants arrived in the Canary Islands last year. Behind these numbers lies a tragic reality. Nearly 10,500 migrants died trying to reach Spain at sea last year. A 50% increase compared to 2023. Special attention will be paid to the unaccompanied minors and other vulnerable migrants, as well as to combating migrant smuggling and human trafficking. We are very grateful to the Parliament of Spain for hosting us and look forward to presenting the highlights of our discussion and our main findings at the annual session in Porto. We also plan to address gender-based violence along migrants' route. On the 5th of March, the committee will hold an online discussion on gender-sensitive migration policies. We will focus on addressing gender-based violence along migration routes and as a driver of migration. We as parliamentarians have a vital role to play in reducing these risks and implementing policies to ensure victim identification and protection. My special thanks to committee member Hedy Fry, who has consistently advocated for gender-sensitive migration policies and will take part in the discussion. Finally, addressing the root causes of migration, including climate change, will always be our objective. Dear colleagues, climate-induced migration is a growing crisis that requires urgent action. We need to shift our focus from fighting against refugees and migrants to fighting the root causes of migration, not only conflict, human rights violations and poverty, but also environmental disasters and climate change. And let me add this, I'm very happy that we have a special representative, dear Madam President, that you adopted with Pere Pons, who is supporting this issue as much as he can. As emphasized yesterday during the meeting of the second committee, tackling climate-induced migration is key to reducing forced displacement within and across borders. Sustainable solution must focus on prevention, building resilience, and providing support to those affected by climate-driven migration while there is still time. And let me finish by thanking Farima Daftari, who is a precious support to our committee. Thank you so much, Farima. What should we do without you? Thank you, dear colleagues, for your attention.
Thank you, Daniela. And I now give the floor to the chair of the Ad Hoc Committee on Countering Terrorism, Mr. Kamil Aydin. You have the floor.
Thank you. Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, and distinguished colleagues, I am honored to deliver today my second report in my capacity as chair of our Ad Hoc Committee on Countering Terrorism. As this is my first official report of the year, I would like to begin by sharing some data related to CCT efforts in 2024, which demonstrate the value and the breadth of our engagement. Last year, the Ad Hoc Committee organized 3 official CCT meetings, 2 sessions of the coordination mechanism for parliamentary assemblies on counterterrorism, 2 thematic policy dialogues, 1 joint side event at the Internet Governance Forum, as well as the official visit to Turkey. Additionally, it contributed to numerous international platforms, such as the Global Conference of Women Parliamentarians and the Doha Youth Parliamentary Forum. Overall, the CCT has actively engaged 23rd PA members in its initiatives, many of whom contributed multiple times, interfacing them with over 80 international and national experts and with more than 120 parliamentarians from across the globe. These intersections brought visibility to our assembly, fueled parliamentary diplomacy, and laid the foundations of our cooperative work, being always alert of new developments and ready to promote policy convergence on complex counterterrorism issues. In this connection, let me recall again the relevance of our resolution on AI and the fight against terrorism, adopted during our annual meeting in Bucharest. This document resulted from several informative debates on the urgent need to address the misuse of AI for terrorist purposes. while responsibly harnessing the power of such technology and safeguarding human rights. With the unanimous adoption of the resolution, the CCT has confirmed its aptness to ponder pressing security challenges and develop cohesive policy proposals. This, incidentally, was the case also in 2023, when our Assembly was among the very first to recognize the terrorist nature of the so-called Wagner Group. Dear colleagues, since our last meeting in Dublin, the CCT has continued to investigate the challenges stemming from the misuse of new technologies for malicious and terrorist purposes, paying particular attention to its impacts on youth. In the current digital age, we are confronted with the extremist groups exploiting online disinformation to incite violence, turning media platforms into tools to spread conspiracy theories and recruit prostitutes. Addressing this challenge has become even more urgent. The use of modern multimedia applications has significantly increased over the last 2 decades among younger individuals. Unfortunately, many of them are lacking the skills required to critically evaluate online content. According to a survey conducted by the European Commission in 2019, 82% of European youth taught that critical thinking, media and democracy are insufficiently taught at schools. In line with our Bucharest Declaration, the CCT is therefore looking at how public education and digital literacy can enhance societal resilience against radicalization leading to violent extremism. The 20th meeting of the CCT, which will take place today at 12:15 in room 532, shall ponder what parliaments can do to foster media and information literacy through educational initiatives at international and national levels. Dear colleagues, in November 2024, members David Stockmiller from Austria and Jerosima Pejovic from Montenegro actively contributed to several sessions of the Doha Youth Parliamentary Forum, underscoring the role of youth in shaping effective counter-terrorism policies and fostering sustainable peace. Moreover, they called for the establishment of more networks of cooperation among youth, also building on the experience of the network of young parliamentarians in the OSCPA. In early December, the fourth Parliamentary Policy Dialogue, dedicated to countering the use of AI and new technologies for terrorist purposes, brought together in Rome around 100 participants from around the world. Jointly organized with UNOCT, this gathering proved instrumental to profile our work on AI and promote a more cohesive global approach in relation to one of the most transformative technological breakthroughs of all time. Moreover, at the 6th meeting of the Coordination Mechanism for Parliamentary Assemblies on Counterterrorism, also convened in the Italian Parliament, we explored the interlinks of terrorism with organized crime. The two phenomena are increasingly related, especially in conflict-affected areas, as different networks cooperate on a daily basis to finance and conduct their illegal activities. I feel obliged to thank the Italian delegation, and in particular, Special Representative on Fighting Organized Crime, Zofili, and CCT Vice Chair Le Porfido, for graciously hosting these important events. Finally, and leveraging on our privileged partnership with the United Nations, in late December, we co-organized a side event on parliamentary approaches to the use of information and communication technologies in countering terrorism in accordance with the US Security Council Resolution 1373 on the margins of the Internet Governance Forum in Riyadh, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Holding this event at the world's most important multi-stakeholder gathering on digital public policy has crowned our engagement on AI. As our 2.5-year presidency of our coordination mechanism of parliamentary assemblies on counterterrorism ended in December 2024, let me briefly report on the legacy we leave behind. What began as an ambitious idea has now become a consolidated reality, bringing together 17 assemblies from Africa, Asia, Europe, and the MENA region and Latin America to strengthen parliamentary work in counter-terrorism. I am particularly proud that Under the OSCPA's leadership, the mechanism flourished. It convened 4 official meetings in diverse locations, such as Doha, Vienna, Istanbul, and Rome, where we explored regional trends and focuses on different aspects of counterterrorism. Alongside these sessions, we hosted 4 parliamentary policy dialogues, addressing critical topics such as artificial intelligence, the protection of vulnerable targets, border security, and the prevention of youth radicalization. These discussions fostered a more coherent parliamentary understanding of complex counterterrorism challenges, linking the security of our region to those of the adjacent ones, and promoting closer to cooperation among lawmakers from all over the world. By representing the coordination mechanism at numerous high-level international events, we have also enhanced the visibility of parliamentary engagement on counterterrorism globally. The mechanism's remarkable expansion from 9 to 17 assemblies in just over 2 years testifies the governing eagerness of parliamentarians to add value in this field. Ultimately, the OSCPA has laid a solid foundation for the successful work of this coordination mechanism and, in the future, setting a high standard for parliamentary diplomacy in addressing global security challenges. Looking ahead, we will continue to engage in the coordination mechanism, and we will contribute with our insights as appropriate. In May, we also aim to conduct an official visit to an OSCE participating state, which would allow us to gather important lessons learned and assess needs on the ground. I will duly report on this activity during the next official session. In conclusion, Madam President, let me assure you that with the wise support of the 2 vice chairs, Mark Rizzi from the States and Emanuele Loperfido from Italy, and diligently advised by our International Secretariat, our committee will continue to actively engage with you all in the coming months. If this report triggered your interest, feel free to attend our 28th official meeting later today and consider officially joining our ad hoc committee. We are always eager to recruit new interested members. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kamil Aydin. Now let's move on to the Parliamentary Support Team for Ukraine. And I'm pleased to inform you that during the reporting period, the PSTU has continued to work on 3 main clusters. Functioning as the Assembly's main liaison with Ukraine, the first cluster of work involved extending the Assembly's support to Ukraine in line with our declarations. This support involved regular communication and coordination with Kyiv, which enabled our support team to stay abreast of developments and to adapt its support in line with emerging needs. Last week's visit to Kyiv by Bureau and our support team members is one practical example of this activity. With a 22-member delegation effectively representing a coalition of 12 parliaments, our assembly was the first international organization to have its governing body to convene on Ukrainian territory since February 2022. Through a combination of meetings with high-level officials, OSCE representatives, civil society, as well as field visits in the Kyiv region, our presence in Ukraine proved extremely productive. Among the positive outcomes, it enabled the Bureau and the Ukrainian support team to receive first-hand updates on key challenges for Ukraine and possible roles for the OSCE. I would like to use this opportunity to particularly thank Chairman Stefanchuk and Vice President Mikita Poturayev for hosting us. The second cluster involved our support team's ongoing contribution to increasing Ukraine's resilience. Through my appointments in November of last year of 3 support team special rapporteurs, the concept of resilience has been placed at the core of our work and activities. Karina Ödebrink, Matti Raidma, and Lucy Potuchkova are all working in their respective fields of expertise and spearheading our efforts to strengthening Ukraine's resilience. The third cluster, dear friends, aims to follow up from an excellent proposal by Luis Grasa, which foresees a set of questions which members of the Bureau and our support team can address to the respective governments on key issues related to Ukraine. The proposal was discussed in Kyiv last week and was met with unanimous support by our Ukrainian support team and Bureau members. One of the questions will touch upon the 3 OSCE officials in detention, essentially inquiring on past actions by governments and encouraging greater engagement to ensure their release. Dear friends, unless there are specific questions, I would now leave it at that and kindly ask Mr. Poturayev from Ukraine to add anything else he deems appropriate and useful.
Thank you, Madam President. I think that you shared the key points about very productive work of Bureau and PSTU in Kyiv. So let me share, colleagues, with some summarize and conclusions after our meetings in Kyiv and yesterday's side event dedicated to Russian crimes against Ukrainian children and women during war. So, dear colleagues, today, just in the past, we are faced with the choice between war and dishonor. And as history has already shown, those who choose dishonor will still have war. Some say that peace can be achieved through concessions to Russia. But let's be clear, the peace built on concessions is not peace at all. It is an invitation to an even greater war, one that will not stop in Ukraine. It will spread, devouring more nations, more lives, and more futures. Why? Because the peace that allows Russia to keep what it has stolen is the peace that legalizes the worst crimes imaginable. It means the world has accepted the rape of children as a tactic of war. It means the mass executions of civilians and prisoners of war go unpunished. It means the torture chambers, the beheadings, the horrors we thought belonged to the darkest chapters of history are becoming the new normal. Can we really call it peace if it allows such crimes to go unpunished? Would you accept such peace for your own people? Do you really want to live in the world where this is normal? Is this the future you want for your children? And if the world accepts this as normal, Russia will know it can commit those crimes again. And it will. The so-called peace deal with Russia would not just mean losing Ukrainian territory. It would mean losing thousands of Ukrainian lives, those who are already being killed on these lands, and those who will be next. It would legitimize ethnic cleansing and mass deportations. It would mean that once again in the 21st century in Europe, entire nations can be erased. And if that happens, what will stop that from happening elsewhere? That is why peace cannot be given to Russia. It cannot be gifted, nor negotiated on their terms. It must be enforced upon them so that they know they cannot fight today or they will be held accountable tomorrow. Yes, we seek peace, but not just any peace. We need last, just, reliably guaranteed and well-protected peace. Because only such peace can exist in Europe and in the world. Because only in such peace can people live rather than exist as slaves. And let me remind you, the fate of democratic and civilized world is not being decided between nuclear superpowers. It has to be decided between democratic and civilized countries. And it is being decided on the front lines where Ukrainian defenders stand against tyranny. I thank you.
Thank you, Mikita Poturayev. We now move on to item number 3 on our agenda, which is remarks by our special guest, Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza. And I will invite Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza to join us at the podium to deliver his remarks. As you all know, Mr. Kara-Murza is one of Russia's foremost opposition figures. In April 2022, after speaking out against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Mr. Kara-Murza was arrested on charges of disobeying police orders. His arrest was extended after prosecutors introduced new charges of discrediting the military. And in October 2022, he was charged with treason. The same month, he was awarded the Václav Havel Human Rights Prize. In April 2023, Mr. Kara-Murza was sentenced to 25 years in prison and sent to a prison colony in Siberia. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for the columns, which he continued to write from his prison cell for the Washington Post. He was released from prison as part of a prisoner exchange deal on the 1st of August 2024, last year, that is. Mr. Kara-Murza spoke yesterday at the side event sponsored by the delegations of Norway and Sweden. I have invited him to address this joint session so that all our delegations have an opportunity to hear his message. Mr. Kara-Murza, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, members of the Assembly, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Before I say anything else, I want to thank you, of course, for the gracious invitation to speak before you today, but first and foremost for your support and your solidarity during the time of my imprisonment. Just a few months ago, I was sitting in a 2-by-3-meter cell in solitary confinement at a maximum security prison in Siberia, certain that this was what the rest of my life was going to look like. The prisoner exchange in August that saved 16 people, including 8 Russian political prisoners, from the hell of Vladimir Putin's gulag, was made possible by you, by the sustained efforts of good people in democratic nations who never stopped advocating, speaking, shouting about all those locked up in Russia for the only crime of opposing Putin's dictatorship and his murderous war in Ukraine. This exchange, our release, has shown yet again that public opinion matters, that public attention saves, and that democracies, when they stand on values and work together, are stronger than any dictatorship can ever hope to be. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the founding stone of this organization, the Helsinki Final Act, that established an inviolable link between international security, economic development, and respect for human rights. For decades, this body has been defined by its most important promise: to create a common space of peace, cooperation, and democracy from Vancouver to Vladivostok. Today, that promise seems farther than ever. In fact, Putin's regime in Russia has clearly proven, albeit in a negative, the interdependence of the 3 baskets of the Helsinki process. Where there is no democracy, there will be neither security nor peace. For nearly 3 years, Putin has been conducting an all-out war against Ukraine, a brutal and unprovoked attack on a peaceful sovereign nation, bombing hospitals and schools, killing civilians, families, children, wiping entire cities from the face of the earth. And for more than 2 decades, he has been leading another war on the freedoms, rights, and dignity of our own citizens in Russia. The freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of elections, and all the other basic rights guaranteed by the OSCE have fallen victim to Putin's rule. And there were literal victims too. Last Sunday marked 1 year since the murder of Alexei Navalny. Next week will be 10 years since the murder of Boris Nemtsov. 2 leaders who gave their lives in a fight for a better Russia. I hope that all those Western politicians who want to return to business as usual with Putin who want to lend Putin international legitimacy, who want to shake Putin's hand, remember that this is a hand covered in blood. Repression in Russia today has reached a level unparalleled since the Soviet era. According to publicly available and self-admittedly incomplete figures, today's Russia holds 1,497 political prisoners, more than the whole of the Soviet Union did in the mid-1980s. That number is growing constantly. This coming week alone, 158 people will be tried in courtrooms across Russia on politically motivated charges. And the fastest growing category on that list are the people who have protested against the war in Ukraine. These protests have taken different forms. In the case of Alexei Gorinov, a Moscow municipal councillor, it was calling for a minute of silence at his council meeting for Ukrainian children killed by Russian bombs. The price was 7 years in prison. In the case of Maria Ponomarenko, a journalist from Siberia and a mother of two, it was writing the truth about the Russian airstrike on a theater in Mariupol that left hundreds of civilians dead. The price was 6 years in prison. In the case of Dmitry Ivanov, a talented young mathematician who posted on social media about war crimes committed by Russian forces in Bucha and elsewhere in Ukraine, and who was arrested on the day of his final exam at Moscow State University before he was able to graduate. The price was 8.5 years in prison, and the list goes on. More names than would be possible to mention. As ceasefire talks begin in the coming weeks, it is imperative that any deal to end the bloodshed in Ukraine provides for the release of all captives of this war, prisoners of war on both sides, as is required by the Third Geneva Convention. Ukrainian civilian hostages, thousands of them, held in Russian detention facilities. Ukrainian children abducted to Russia, a war crime that has resulted in Putin's indictment by the International Criminal Court, and Russian political prisoners, my fellow citizens who refuse to stay silent in the face of this atrocity, even at the cost of their own freedom. Putin's propaganda wants the world to believe that all Russians support his regime, that all Russians back his war. But actions speak louder than words, and the ever-growing spiral of repression tells a very different story. The hundreds who are imprisoned, the thousands who faced administrative charges, the tens of thousands detained by police at anti-war protests, the hundreds of thousands who signed petitions to get an anti-war candidate on a presidential ballot last year. These are the faces of a different Russia. The Russia Vladimir Putin does not want you to see. Not the Russia of murderers and war criminals who are sitting in the Kremlin, but the Russia of decent and good-hearted people who oppose them. Not the archaic, repressive, belligerent Russia of today, but a hopeful, peaceful, democratic Russia of tomorrow. A Russia that would finally fulfill that promise of a common space of peace, cooperation, and democracy from Vancouver to Vladivostok. I believe in this promise with all my heart. I know that many of you do too. Let us work together to make it a reality. Thank you very much.
Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you for your excellent and at the same time very devastating introduction to Russia's reality. And now we need to move on to item number 4 on our agenda, which is general debate on priority challenges to European security. And we have approximately 70 names on the list, which is quite a high number, I must say. And therefore, the time limit for each intervention is 2 minutes. So I first call Mr. Selami Altinok from Turkey to take the floor, and he will be followed by Mr. Joe Wilson from the United States.
Evet. Gitsin bakalım. Tamam mı? Bir okey verin bana. Ne? Sayın Başkan, değerli meslektaşlarım, Avrupa'nın mevcut güvenlik ortamı, geleneksel tehditler ile yeni ortaya çıkan risklerin iç içe geçtiği karmaşık bir yapı ile şekillenmektedir. Bu durum, işbirliği, esneklik ve stratejik öngörü gerektiren güçlü bir kararlılığı zorunlu kılmaktadır. Ancak Avrupa'nın güvenliği yalnızca kıta içindeki ülkelerin kendi güvenlik çabalarıyla sağlanamaz. Aksine çevresini kapsayan bölgelerdeki istikrarsızlıkları ve küresel tehditleri gerçekçi bir şekilde ele almayı gerektirir. Güvenlik sadece sınırlarla açıklanabilecek bir kavram değildir. Dolayısıyla Avrupa'nın güvenliği komşu bölgelerdeki barış ve huzurun tesis edilmesine doğrudan bağlıdır. Bu bağlamda Orta Doğu'daki gelişmeler Avrupa'nın güvenliği açısından kritik bir öneme sahiptir. Özellikle Gazze'de yaşanan insani trajedi görmezden gelinemez bir gerçektir. Filistin halkının yıllardır maruz kaldığı soykırıma varan zulüm son 2 yılda dayanılmaz bir boyuta ulaşmış iken ateşkesin sağlanması, rehine tutuklu değişiminin de gerçekleşmesi ve insani yardımların bir kısmının kesintisiz bir şekilde Gazze'ye ulaşması önemli adımlardır. Ancak tüm bunlar kalıcı barış için yeterli değildir. Gazze'nin Filistinlerin ise Gazze'den koparılması asla düşünülemez. Filistinlerin Gazze'den Ürdün ve Mısır başta olmak üzere 3. ülkelere göç ettirilmesine ilişkin açıklamalar ise büyük endişe kaynağıdır ve kesinlikle kabul edilemez niteliktedir. Kıymetli meslektaşlarım, Avrupa'nın güvenliği açısından Suriye'de kalıcı istikrar ve güven ortamının sağlanması ise bir diğer arzumuzdur. Yeni yönetimin kapsayıcı ve adil bir yapıya sahip olması bölgenin istikrarı açısından elzemdir. Bizler de uluslararası toplum olarak Suriye halkının yıllardır süregelen çatışma ortamından kurtulması ve ülkenin yeniden inşası için elimizden gelen çabayı göstermeliyiz. Öte yandan küresel güvenlik ve istikrara yönelik başlıca tehditlerden biri olmaya devam eden Ukrayna'daki savaş 4. yılına girerken savaşta yeni dönüm noktasına dair beklentiler ışığında Türkiye olarak tarafların müzakerelere istekli olması halinde yine kolaylaştırıcı bir rol üstlenmeye hazırız. Sonuç olarak Avrupa'nın güvenliği çerçevesinde bölgelerin güvenliğiyle doğrudan bağlantılıdır. Bugün karşı karşıya kaldığımız tehditler işbirliği ve diyalog temelinde çözüme kavuşturulmalıdır. Türkiye olarak diplomatik yeteneklerimiz ve bölgesel tecrübemizle bu sürecin öncüsü olmaya ve elimizi taşın altına koymaya hazırız. Teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Mr. Joe Wilson from the United States. And he will be followed by Ms. Siv Muslet from Norway. Joe Wilson, you have the floor.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, it is very humbling and inspiring to be with you today. And I'm very grateful to be here on my way from Munich to Cairo, to Jerusalem, to Amman, and now to Vienna. And so it's just very humbling to be here. And as we're here today, the right of citizens to freely elect their democratic representatives is foundational to peace in the world. As we know, true democracies have never gone to war against each other. In the current situation in America, it is very bipartisan, as evidenced yesterday by the inspiring statement by my colleague, Democrat Congressman Mark Vesey, who's here today. Again, I'm Republican Joe Wilson of South Carolina, so it's bipartisan. Also bicameral. I want to show you in the U.S. Senate, there are strong proponents of what I'm saying today. It's not unilateral. The OSCE and the Assembly is rooted in the seminal insight must be at the forefront of advancing democracy, which requires the holding of fair and free elections. Sadly, we're witnessing a trend of democratic backsliding in the OSCE region that, unless arrested and reversed, will endanger European security, individual freedom, and economic prosperity, creating jobs. It is most concerning about the fraudulent election held in Georgia in October and disturbing pattern of repression that has followed in the wake, tragically providing for the rigged election that occurred in Georgia. The de facto Georgian Dream regime in Tbilisi stands in violation of its freely undertaken OSCE commitments to hold fair and free elections and uphold its citizens. Fundamental freedoms subsequently have been forfeited as to its democratic legitimacy. As a result, I call on my colleagues to insist on new elections and to decline regular interaction with the Georgian Dream dictatorship until they can fulfill their demands. In fact, the current Georgian Dream delegation today is illegitimate and has not been elected in a fair and free election as determined by election observers worldwide. Keeping that in mind, while the Georgian Dream has long-standing EU and NATO aspirations denied, we must act. I agree with the Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen of Denmark at Munich. We are not in a Ukraine war. It is a Russian war to reenact and recreate the failed Soviet Union. Today in Ukraine, but actually we see it as occupying Transnistria of Moldova, in 2008 invading South Ossetia and Abkhazia of Georgia, invading Crimea and then the Donbass of Ukraine, rigging elections in Belarus with dictator Lukashenko, failing in Moldova, thankfully, and failing currently in Romania, but rigging elections, as we see in Georgia. And something very significant, as I've just returned from the Middle East, they've lost, war criminal Putin has lost his ally Assad in Syria. And this has been done because the people of Syria, the people of the Middle East, have been encouraged by the Ukrainian resistance to war criminal Putin. And we must stand together for peace through strength. And I believe we will be successful. Additionally, looking ahead, I would like to draw particular attention to upcoming elections in Albania, Moldova, Romania, and Turkestan. It's important that each of these countries ensure a fair and free vote. It is extremely disturbing that OSCE has had to withdraw its election observers from Tajikistan because the government did not accredit the observers of the OSCE, which is particularly sad, again, as war criminal Putin is seeking to recreate the failed Soviet Union, which would not include Tajikistan as an independent country. Moldova and Romania must remain keenly alert to the dangers of the foreign interference from war criminal Putin. It is also my hope that Serbia will hold free and fair elections soon to respond to the massive displays of popular discontent in the country in recent weeks. Transparent, competitive, democratic elections are the best means of addressing growing distrust in the institutions and preserving peace in the OSCE region, with the stability and prosperity creating jobs. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. And now the next speaker is Mrs. Siv Muslet from Norway, and she will be followed by Mr. Nicholas Samkaradze from Georgia. Muslet, you have the floor.
Madam President, colleagues, we see more mistrust and less communication between states. The risk of misunderstandings and conflicts is on the rise. Sabotage, cable cuts, and other hostile acts in Europe signal that we are moving further up the conflict spectrum. 50 years ago, the Helsinki Act was created as a solid platform for dialogue and cooperation to increase our common security. As Vladimir Kara-Murza just described, Russia has ignored the Helsinki Agreement. We, the Norwegian and the Swedish delegation, are very thankful that Evgenia and Vladimir Kara-Murza could take part in our side event yesterday. Dear friends, it's been 3 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The level of death and destruction is almost beyond comprehension. We saw this again during our visit to Ukraine last week. Ukraine should be given strong security guarantees. Ukraine and Europe must be involved in any negotiation to achieve a just and lasting peace. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Nothing about Europe without Europe. Norway is giving major military and civilian assistance. Our support for Ukraine will be larger than ever this year. Colleagues, many of us took part in the election observation in Georgia in October. We are deeply concerned over the current situation. We condemn the use of brutal force by police and security forces against protesters, media workers, civil society, and the opposition in Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Moslet. I then give the floor to Mr. Nicholas Samkaradze from Georgia, and he will be followed by Mr. Mark Pritchard from United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, first and foremost, I would like to bring to your attention the most painful and deeply concerning development affecting the Georgian nation. This is the ongoing illegal occupation of Georgian regions, Abkhazia and Tkhinvali, and the recent events that have further aggravated the situation on the ground. So-called presidential elections were held last Saturday in Russian-occupied region of Abkhazia. Furthermore, 2 polling stations were opened for these sham elections in Moscow and Cherkassk, so on the territory of the Russian Federation. We strictly condemn so-called presidential elections in the occupied region of Abkhazia and the opening of so-called polling stations on the territory of Russian Federation. This represents a flagrant breach of international law and yet another attempt to violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Georgia. Let me underline that until restoration of Georgia's jurisdiction over the occupied territories, all activities and legislative acts by the de facto authorities are declared null and void. It is alarming that the vast majority of European states fail to condemn holding these so-called elections. The shortcomings in addressing occupation of Georgia's territories within the broader context of European security evoke a feeling that ensuring stability, peaceful coexistence, respect for the national sovereignty and determination of ongoing occupation are beyond the capabilities of this and other international organizations. Mr. Wilson, if you were honest in your address, you would have also condemned the so-called sham elections in the occupied region of Abkhazia. But now let me get to the next matter of no less significance, which is the parliamentary elections in Georgia. While the elections were held in a politically pluralistic environment, with introduction of electronic technologies that ensured transparency and were organized much better than all previously held elections, certain group of foreign politicians, including Mr. Wilson here, chose not to recognize results, persisting in dissemination of entirely unverified claims and disinformation. One member of the European Parliament even accused, and I'm quoting, OSCE ODIHR being under the influence of the regimes that are not interested in a free and fair elections. Such statements not only seek to undermine the reputation and integrity of OSCE itself, but also highlight their utter disregard for the willful choice of the Georgian people. We are also deeply concerned about the pressures that had been applied to OSCE ODIHR mission from certain political foreign groups to influence the contents of the final report and about interference of these politicians in the pre-election campaign. We stress the importance of upholding the principles of international law and call for unequivocal support, respect, and support towards the freely expressed will of the Georgian voters, urging all parties to honor the decision with unwavering commitment to Georgian people's sovereign rights. And there are no reports from any international, credible international organizations that have said that the elections in Georgia were rigged. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Samkaradze. And next I give the floor to Mr. Mark Pritchard from the United Kingdom, and he will be followed by Ms. Lucia Thatcher from Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. Since its inception, this organization has seen its fair share of challenges. But what is unshakable in the member states represented here today is our unending belief in the rule of law, democracy, and freedom. From Vancouver to Vladivostok, all peoples want to be free of overburdening government. And at the heart of what we do is multilateralism, dialogue, people, putting people first. But as we have seen with Russia's brutal and illegal war against Ukraine, the Helsinki principles can never be taken for granted. Neither can democracy. They need to be guarded, protected, exercised. And as the global order is tested and even shaken, the OSCPA can and must play its part in bringing peoples and countries together, not dividing them. For there is much more that unites us than divides us. For all of our member states, it is unity that is our strength, brought together by common values for the common good. And whilst all eyes are on Washington, it is perhaps, and there may be some irony here as a UK politician, although I voted Remain in the referendum, and whilst all eyes are on Washington, it is perhaps in Brussels that the new way forward, navigating a new path in modern diplomacy, will be crafted. This is a time to complement, not compete, with our American friends and cousins. And in the modern parlance, perhaps to co-work on diplomacy and politics with Washington, to stand together against tyranny and unchecked power. The center ground of politics and diplomacy is not dead. It just needs for all of us to have a more honest conversation on Europe's greatest threats and how those threats are countered. By the way, both internal as well as external. Finally, rather than accepting in a timid way the retreat of the Helsinki principles, I would argue this is a time for this organization to have a clear message that freedom, democracy, and the rule of law are never to be surrendered. This is a time for us to stand up, to fight for this organization, for the values that we all believe in and the peoples we represent believe in, rather than put up the white flag to either friends or our enemies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. Next speaker is Ms. Lucia Taser from Slovenia, and she will be followed by Dr. Hedy Fry from Canada.
Thank you, President. Slovenia is a nation of 2 million people, governed by foreign powers throughout its history. After World War II, we were able to form a state with our fellow South Slavic nations, and in 1991, Slovenes established their own country. Due to our size and our historical experience, multilateralism is in our blood. It is the only way to maintain a world order based on international law and not governed by the rule of force. This is why we stand with Ukraine and urge for a peace process geared at fair and lasting peace. This is why we are leading initiatives on these issues in the UN Security Council, where we are currently serving as an alternate member, routinely urging for the updated events on the war in coordination with Ukraine. With the United States, we have a tradition of great relations, also in parliamentary diplomacy. However, I must express great concern with the positions recently expressed by the administration regards to reaching peace in Ukraine and in Gaza, which are in complete contradiction with international rules on sovereignty of states and basic human rights. I must express that the US positions in this Parliamentary Assembly are much more in line with those principles. However, the administration's positions remain extremely concerning. Fellow parliamentarians, from these discussions over the past 2 days, it is obvious that we are not representatives of like-minded states. However, for the sake of our future, I do wish that we will put the quest of finding the common denominator for cooperation and security of our citizens in Europe at the forefront. Dialogue, diplomacy, and multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tazer. And next speaker is Dr. Hedi Fry from Canada, and she will be followed by Jelena Nedovic from Montenegro. All right. In that case, I will give the floor directly to Jelena Nedovic from Montenegro, and she will be followed by Mr. Eugenio Ciofili from Italy.
Thank you. Esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to speak one of the most important issues of our time, the priority challenges to European security. In a time of challenging geopolitical tensions, our collective security and stability rely on unity, strength, and strategic action. Please, when we speak about EU, you need to wake up, because there is a new rules in this world. The war in Ukraine remains the most urgent and defending security challenge for EU. This conflict that lasts almost 2 years now must come to end. And we need to do something so that the process of healing and rebuilding can begin. And we don't have time to wait anymore. Peace is not just a necessity for Ukraine, but for the stability of Europe as a whole. I need to say that Montenegro is a factor of stability in the Western Balkans and a reliable support for NATO in the region. In this context, I would like to highlight the recent remarks by European Parliament President Roberta Metsola, who emphasized that Europe must be responsible for its own security. So I need to say again, Europe must be responsible for its own security. To enhance our defense capabilities, we must respond to this call to action and strive for a more unified and self-sufficient European defense framework. The challenging global security environment requires both Europe and NATO to be adaptable and protective. As the security landscape shifts, Europe must lead with both strength and flexibility. It's our duty to build stronger partnership, increase defense capabilities, and foster invitation and innovation within NATO, ensuring that we are prepared for the challenges of tomorrow, and we don't have time to wait anymore. Our ability to adopt a new threat will be crucial in maintaining peace, protecting our values, and preserve the security of all member nations in time to come. So the challenges we face are complex, but through unity, I say unity. When we speak about European Union, the unity is most important. Commitment and decisive action, we can preserve European security and uphold the values that bind us together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nedovic. And the next speaker is Mr. Eugenio Ciofili from Italy, and he will be followed by Dr. Hedi Fry from Canada.
Grazie Presidente Kauma. La delegazione italiana all'Assemblea parlamentare dell'OSCE ci siamo riuniti, abbiamo avuto una riunione di delegazione ieri e dimostrando concretezza e una grande maturità abbiamo, Presidente Kauma, elaborato una dichiarazione congiunta sul conflitto in Ucraina che vado ad esporre ai colleghi e vado a leggere. La delegazione italiana presso l'Assemblea parlamentare OSCE, di fronte al perdurare della guerra in Ucraina, sottolinea l'urgenza di un intervento efficace di questa organizzazione per contribuire concretamente sotto il profilo parlamentare alla fine del conflitto. L'impatto umano dei combattimenti è devastante, mentre le conseguenze politiche dello scontro costituiscono una minaccia sempre più grave alla stabilità globale. Considerato che martedì 18 febbraio a Riyadh in Arabia Saudita l'incontro tra delegati americani e russi ha avviato la prima fase di un processo negoziale che dovrà avere l'obiettivo di arrivare ad una pace giusta e duratura per il popolo ucraino, la delegazione italiana, Presidente, ritiene che in questo contesto l'Assemblea dell'OSCE debba svolgere un ruolo decisivo come rappresentanza democratica dei Paesi aderenti. L'organizzazione dell'OSCE è infatti nata per promuovere il dialogo e la cooperazione tra gli Stati membri, stimolando i rispettivi parlamenti e governi a farsi promotori di iniziative di sensibilizzazione al tema della pace. La sua importanza si manifesta altresì nella capacità di offrire uno spazio istituzionale e politico entro il quale nazioni diverse possano dialogare e confrontarsi, contribuendo così alla prevenzione dei conflitti e alla gestione delle crisi. In questo delicato momento storico è opportuno quindi che l'Assemblea parlamentare dell'OSCE assuma un ruolo di ancor più alto profilo nel rafforzamento della cooperazione interparlamentare tra i Paesi membri dell'organizzazione, valorizzando, e chiedo ancora qualche secondo, Presidente, la sua natura peculiare di piattaforma essenziale per discutere questioni relative alla sicurezza regionale ed internazionale. E sulla base di queste premesse, la delegazione italiana, nello spirito dell'atto finale di Helsinki, di cui ricorrono, e l'abbiamo ricordato più volte, i 50 anni, propone a questa Assemblea di convocare una conferenza parlamentare OSCE per la pace in Ucraina che coinvolga tutte, e dico tutte, le delegazioni parlamentari dei Paesi membri, con l'obiettivo di elaborare strategie efficaci per bloccare l'aggressione russa e le tensioni militari, rafforzando le relazioni diplomatiche tra le parti coinvolte, in particolare per supportare, sotto il profilo parlamentare, il raggiungimento di una soluzione definitiva di pace giusta e duratura, attraverso negoziati costruttivi basati su trasparenza, fiducia reciproca e rispetto degli accordi internazionali. Questa, Presidente Kauma, è la dichiarazione della delegazione italiana. Concludo e sarò velocissimo, ma è molto importante, ci teniamo molto. Lei ha avuto modo, Presidente, di incontrarlo a Roma, a Città del Vaticano. Io chiedo a questa Assemblea un grande applauso e un forte abbraccio al nostro Papa Francesco. Abbracciamo anche i colleghi e la delegazione della Santa Sede. Papa Francesco è ricoverato in ospedale a Roma. Ho letto che questa mattina si è alzato, ha fatto colazione, lo abbracciamo con grandissimo affetto. Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. Zoffili. And I next give the floor to Dr. Hedi Fry from Canada, and she will be followed by Mr. Kyriakos Hadiani from Cyprus.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm not sure whether we're debating security or I'm giving a report. I have no idea which. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on what I think right now is the most important existential crisis that's facing OSCE region and OSCE PA. And we know that we've talked about it in the past, but we are no longer here to talk. We need to start developing a strategy, and I agree with what the member from Italy just said. We have to start developing a strategy For too long, those of us who believe in democracy and rule of law and all of the principles of Helsinki have felt that we were the good guys. We were always on the side of right. We always felt that no one could challenge good and right. But we are seeing it being challenged now around the world, and especially in this region, not only by Russia, but we're seeing other large players in the world who have begun to make decisions that are anti-democratic and that are walking away from rule of law, walking away from treaties, walking away from agreements. We have to no longer talk. We have to come up with a concrete strategic plan. And the only people who can do that is this PA. The OSCE is hamstrung quite often by the veto power, by the consensus -1. We decided that we were going to deal on majority, and parliamentarians of every single stripe in every single country that values democracy, that values security, that values the rule of law have to come together and fight back. And I don't mean with guns, but we have to fight back the only way we know how. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for your very strong speech, Dr. Fry. I now give the floor to Mr. Kyriakos Hadiani from Cyprus, and he will be followed by Mr. Marek Raci from Slovakia.
Vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin. Dear members, dear colleagues, Europe has been faced in recent years threats undermining the peace and stability, from the Ukrainian crisis to cyber attacks, hybrid threats to rising tensions in the Middle East. The need for a new security policy is more urgent than ever before. Collective action, strategic vision, and strong political commitment are required. I believe that European defense capability must be strengthened. Strengthening European defense and developing a common strategic approach in an effort to counter military and hybrid threats is imperative. Digital threats, assaults on critical infrastructure, and disinformation are a real risk to European society. We need a single service for information exchange, additional European regulation, and training to protect our digital environment. We continue to be threatened by terrorism, illegal arms trafficking, and migratory flows exploited by criminal organized networks. Cyprus is at the forefront of the fight against illegal migration and human smuggling and has made significant progress through cooperation with the European Union. The area of West Balkans is of crucial significance for European security because of its geostrategic location. We support the European future of the Western Balkan countries. The integration of these countries into the EU is necessary for the stability and security of the region and for the European security as well. Energy. Europe's vulnerability to geopolitical shocks require the diversification of energy resources. Europe must invest in renewable alternatives. In recent years, there has been an effort by Cyprus to explore its natural resources in its exclusive economic zones. These measures are capable of diversifying energy resources for Europe and reduces its dependency on other energy resources. But in this process, Cyprus is faced with geopolitical issues and put the region's stability and security at a big risk. Cooperation through dialogue is necessary. Parliamentary Assembly has a crucial role for this challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyriakos. And the next speaker is Mr. Marek Raci from Slovakia, and he will be followed by Mr. Ville Kaunisto from Finland.
Thank you, Madam President, dear colleagues, distinguished delegates. We stand at the defining moments for Europe's collective future. The war in Ukraine has exposed not only the brutality of Russian aggression, but also a difficult truth about ourselves. This war is possible not only because of the aggressor's resolve, but also because of our weakness and failure to act decisively. History has given us painful lessons. In 1938, the world witnessed the betrayal of Czechoslovakia in Munich, appeasement that led not to peace, but to war. Today, as world powers discuss Ukraine's future without Ukraine at the table, we risk repeating the same mistakes. Let's not be divided. A false peace that rewards the invader is no peace at all. It's surrender in slow motion. This year's conference in Munich has shown very clearly that Europe can no longer rely on US leadership to guarantee its security. While some may see this as a crisis, we must see it as an opportunity to take responsibility for our own defense and strengthen our unity. Yet unity remains our greatest weakness. Internal disputes, populism, and leaders lacking courage threaten our collective strength. Within our own ranks, we find those who are ready to give up our freedom just to befriend Moscow. By questioning Ukraine's right to self-defense, they question our own security. Slovakia, my own country, is experiencing this struggle firsthand. But Slovak citizens have shown time and again that they stand on the right side of history by opening their homes to Ukrainian refugees, providing humanitarian aid, and even taking to the street to voice their stance against those who try to undermine our freedom. There are reasons for hope. Many European nations have shown commitment to stand behind Ukraine, regardless of wavering support from across the Atlantic. Supporting Ukraine is not just about defending our one nation, it's about defending our own European security. The path to true peace is not found in surrender, but in strength and justice, in defending our values, and in showing the world that free nations do not back down. The road ahead will not be easy, but if each one of us gathered here today commits to do everything within our power, then we will not only secure Ukraine's success, we will secure the future of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Graji. And I next give the floor to Mr. Ville Kaunisto from Finland, and he will be followed by Mr. Sergei Rashkov from Belarus.
Madam President, dear colleagues, we live in times when one must understandably wonder whether friends remain true, whether being an ally still holds meaning. A time when it seems that our future and our security are decided by the few rather than the many. A time when collaboration like that within the OSCE might be perceived as a weakness rather than a strength. All this raises a fundamental question for our spring meeting here in Vienna, a question we must confront in order to choose the right path forward. Is it possible that this is the last time we gather here together? Is the road that began in Helsinki, Finland 50 years ago now coming to an end during Finland's chairmanship? I truly hope not, but one thing is certain. If we do not choose to act for a stronger future for OSCE, someone else will. And the answer they choose may not be the one we hope for. Ultimately, it all comes back to the sovereignty of Ukraine. We have learned through blood and sacrifice that appeasement is merely the prelude to greater suffering. There can be no compromise with those who march under the banner of conquest. Ukraine's fight is our fight. Its struggle is our struggle, and its victory must be our victory. Let it be said years from now that when the moment of trial came, we did not shrink in fear. Let it be remembered that we stood firmly, unyielding, and defiant in the face of tyranny. And let the history record that when freedom called, we answered. That is how the OSCE will see also the next 50 years.
Thank you, Ville. Next speaker is Mr. Sergei Rashkov from Belarus, and he will be followed by Mr. Denis Ducarme from Belgium.
Благодарю вас, госпожа председатель. Среди приоритетных вызовов и задач, которые необходимо решать нашей организации, Беларусь видит следующее.
Во-первых, как остановить скатывание в эскалационную воронку? Во-вторых, как восстановить доверие и реанимировать дух Хельсинки, особенно с учетом нынешнего юбилейного года? И в-третьих, как спасти ОБСЕ от дезинтеграции? Ведь тот институциональный кризис, из которого не может выбраться наша организация, это как раз следствие тотального дефицита доверия и пренебрежения ряда, в кавычках, избранных стран мнением остальных. Ультиматумы для решения этих вопросов явно не сработают. Нужен как минимум возврат к принципу неделимости безопасности, который зафиксирован в Уставе Организации Объединенных Наций и основополагающих документах ОБСЕ. К сожалению, на пространстве ОБСЕ этот принцип дает сбой. Это привело к катастрофическим последствиям, в том числе кризису вокруг Украины. Беларусь изначально выступала за мирное урегулирование украинского кризиса путем переговоров и предпринимала для этого практические усилия. Мы сейчас готовы сделать все от нас зависящее для мира и безопасности в регионе. И, разумеется, любые договоренности, которые будут достигаться в этой связи, должны включать в себя и обеспечение гарантий безопасности Беларуси. Парламентская ассамблея ОБСЕ призвана быть объективным форумом для равноправного, открытого и инклюзивного диалога и сотрудничества, ценность которых особенно возрастает в условиях текущего обострения геополитической конфронтации. Подходы, лишающие полноправных членов Ассамблеи возможности предоставлять свои национальные позиции, подрывают международный авторитет и основы всей нашей организации. Говоря это, речь идет о недопуске белорусской делегации для участия в сессиях в Бухаресте и Дублине. В этой связи делегация Беларуси в очередной раз призывает вас, уважаемая госпожа председатель, использовать свой авторитет главы Ассамблеи, имеющий равные обязательства перед всеми, без исключения членами ПА ОБСЕ, для обеспечения реальной, а не декларативной инклюзивности деятельности Ассамблеи. Благодарю вас.
Thank you, Mr. Rashkov. And the next speaker is Mr. Denis Ducarme from Belgium, and he will be followed by Mr. Azay Goulier from Azerbaijan.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Il nous faut répéter aujourd'hui, comme hier, combien nous condamnons l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie de M. Poutine en violation flagrante du droit international et de l'acte final d'Helsinki. Il n'y a cependant pas que la Russie qui doit être blâmée aujourd'hui ici. Ce n'est en effet pas la Russie de M. Poutine qui vient de qualifier M. Zelensky de dictateur. Ce n'est pas la Russie de M. Poutine qui vient de confisquer les négociations aux Européens et la liberté des Ukrainiens à disposer d'eux-mêmes. C'est les États-Unis de M. Trump qui viennent de le faire, c'est eux qui doivent être blâmés pour ça. Le président finlandais, M. Stubb, nous disait « Europe must choose between the moment of Yalta and the moment of Helsinki ». Monsieur Trump a choisi Yalta. Nous devons continuer à nous battre pour Helsinki. Merci à Monsieur Macron pour les initiatives qu'il prend. Il défend le principe d'Helsinki et la vision des Européens à décider pour eux-mêmes, sur leur continent, de la sécurité de l'Europe. Et donc, il nous faut choisir entre ces deux moments. Dans diplomatie parlementaire, il y a diplomatie, mais il y a également politique. Comme bon nombre de parlementaires de cette Assemblée, j'aspire à une OSCE qui prenne davantage de responsabilités politiques, qui soit plus offensive en matière politique, qui soit plus démonstrative publiquement de ses convictions. Nous aurons l'occasion d'en reparler lors de la session de Porto. Merci pour votre attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ducarme. The next speaker is Mr. Azay Goulier from Azerbaijan, and he will be followed by Ms. Liliana Tanguy from France.
Thank you, Madam President, dear colleagues. We gather in Vienna at a pivotal moment for the OSCE region.
The foundations of our security order, rooted in multilateralism and the Helsinki Final Act, are under serious threat. The erosion of multilateralism is not merely a theoretical concern, it is an existential challenge which can potentially lead to irreversible ramifications for diplomacy and international affairs. Zero-sum politics and geopolitical confrontation not only jeopardize cooperative security, but also undermine the credibility of international and regional organizations. Azerbaijan has directly experienced the consequences of violations of the Helsinki Final Act's core principles. This is why we remain steadfast in our call for the full and unconditional respect of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states. As we mark the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, reaffirming these principles is more urgent than ever. Any compromise weakens European security and emboldens forces that seek instability and division. As a non-aligned country, Azerbaijan upholds the principle of indivisible security. No state has the right to impose its security or national interests at the expense of others, particularly those outside political military alliances. At the same time, as our experience shows, regional ownership should be a key principle in dealing with regional affairs, while external players need to refrain from taking unilateral actions causing instability. Distinguished colleagues, we stand at the defining crossroads. The decision we make today will shape the OSCE's future and determine its role in history. The current situation requires this organization to conduct necessary evaluations and reforms, including by streamlining its structural framework and effective utilization of its resources to adapt and remain relevant. Learning from the past conflicts, identifying the causes of failures in conflict resolution, and enhancing effectiveness and transparency are key in finding solutions to the challenges. Only such an approach can contribute to strengthening multilateralism and safeguarding the security of all participating states. If we allow the foundations of this institution to be eroded, we risk not only the security of our nations, but also the prosperity of our future. Let us act with clarity, resolve, and unity. The OSCE must remain a strong and impartial force for stability and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Azai. And dear colleagues, please, let's try to stick to the 2-minute time frame.
Merci. Merci.
And I next give the floor to Mr. Liliana Tanguy, who will be followed by Mrs. Skaidrite Abrama from Latvia.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Chers collègues, la conférence de Munich sur la sécurité l'a confirmé. L'architecture de sécurité européenne d'après-guerre n'existe plus. Face à une Russie toujours plus offensive et une Amérique dont l'engagement au sein de l'OTAN ne peut plus être tenu pour acquis, l'Europe doit réagir. La France défend depuis longtemps l'idée d'une Europe capable de garantir sa propre sécurité avec une défense plus indépendante et une véritable autonomie stratégique. Cet objectif passe par deux priorités. D'une part, le renforcement d'une communauté européenne de défense et d'autre part, une augmentation substantielle des budgets militaires. Aujourd'hui, malgré les initiatives européennes comme la stratégie de défense industrielle, notre dépendance aux États-Unis pour l'équipement militaire reste trop importante. Mais alors que nous construisons une défense européenne plus forte, pouvons-nous nous permettre de négliger le dialogue ? L'OSCE, en réunissant à la même table l'Europe et d'autres acteurs clés, reste un forum unique. C'est pour cela qu'elle doit continuer à remplir son mandat conformément aux principes du droit international. Toutefois, la guerre d'agression que la Russie mène contre l'Ukraine depuis maintenant 3 ans viole tous les engagements issus des textes fondateurs de l'OSCE sur lesquels repose la stabilité de l'Europe. Face à cette nouvelle donne sécuritaire et au risque de désengagement des États-Unis, faisant peser une menace réelle sur l'Europe, la France, par la voix de son président Emmanuel Macron, appelle à une paix durable et solide qui permette à l'Ukraine d'avoir des garanties de sécurité et une paix négociée par les Ukrainiens. Dans cette situation préoccupante dans laquelle la sécurité de l'Europe est en jeu sur le théâtre en Ukraine, l'OSCE doit renforcer ses missions pour une coopération européenne accrue, y compris en matière de défense. Cela suppose de renforcer le pilier européen de sécurité de défense et de développer des capacités communes à l'Europe par le biais d'un financement européen commun massif proposé par le président Macron afin d'assurer l'autonomie stratégique de l'Europe, qui est la seule garante de notre liberté et de nos valeurs. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Ms. Tanguy. And next speaker is Ms. Gaidrite Abrama from Latvia, and she will be followed by Ms. Gaia Mamadon from
Madam
Azerbaijan.
President, distinguished colleagues, first, thank you for possibility to speak today at this crucial time for European and global security. I think we all here stand united by our shared values and commitment to freedom, democracy, mutual support. And the threats we face today are not abstract, they are real and tangible. Security, integrity, sovereignty is under threat, and concrete steps are needed. 3 years ago, Russia began its aggressive, brutal invasion of Ukraine, and that still hasn't ended. 3 long years of occupation, murder, looting, human rights violations. What Russia is doing is not just an attack on Ukraine, it's an attack on the very foundation of our security architecture, our shared values, our economic stability. Putin and his regime have demonstrated that they are emboldened by weakness and do not act in good faith. The only way to counter aggressive dictatorships is from a position of economic, strategic, military strength. Peace through strength applies not only to military capability, but also to our ability to sustain economic and community resilience. From Latvia's perspective, it's clear that Ukraine must and will be supported. Today, supporting Ukraine is not about military aid. It's also about ensuring peace and economic stability in Europe. Any peace agreement must be accepted by Ukraine with full EU engagement. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine must be a strong statement made by the OSCE. To uphold these values, Latvia is providing strong military assistance to the Ukraine armed force and civil society. We have made national and external security our top budget priority for 2025. 3.45% of our GDP is allocated to defense this year, 4 to 5% next year's. Alongside this, we are making strategic investments in cybersecurity and defense industry. And I call all democratic OSCE countries not to stop supporting Ukraine, not just in words, but also in real deeds. Yesterday, we discussed about advancing common OSCE approach in promoting economic and environmental sustainability and security. Energy resilience is also a key pillar of security strategy of Latvia. And I am glad to inform you that since February 9, Latvia, as well as Lithuania and Estonia, are fully disconnected from the Russia Braille energy system, getting rid of reliance on Russian-controlled energy infrastructure. We are moving towards green energy goals that safeguarding our economy from external pressure, ensuring sustainable and diversification of renewable energy sources. To conclude, the security and future of Europe as a whole also depends on our counterforce to aggression, on our mutual support, our economic independence and strength. The future belongs to those who are prepared. OSCE 50 years ago established for the purpose of security and economic cooperation must justify its existence at this crucial moment for nations and must also act with urgency and strong determination, contributing that Europe remains strong, sovereign and economically secure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Abrama. Next speaker is Mr. Gaia Mamadon from Azerbaijan, and he will be followed by Ms. Milena Apostolaki from Greece.
Madam President, we welcome this timely debate as the country in relation to which Helsinki final principles were violated en masse. We were one of the first countries that felt deeply to be let down by the OSCE's failure to uphold its own principles. We need a comprehensive review of what went wrong, both within the OSCE and in its parliamentary dimension. Now, allow me to stress a few points. First, we should try to end double standards and selective application of international law. Misusing human rights for political purposes is unacceptable. This damages human rights more than individual cases of violations. For example, total disregard for the right to return of ethnically cleansed Azerbaijanis is an appalling hypocrisy. Two, respect the universal principle of consent of parties in peace efforts. Attempts to impose mediation violate international law, including specific UN General Assembly resolutions. For example, attempts to perpetuate so-called OSCE Minsk group aim to create a conflict does not serve peace. Whatever achieved between Azerbaijan and Armenia on normalization was achieved in bilateral track. Azerbaijan remains committed to address outstanding issues bilaterally and in goodwill. Armenia must show reciprocal political will and remove all remaining obstacles to peace. And international community should not leave states affected by war of aggression to deal with its aftermath alone. For example, Armenia caused $150 billion damages by destroying nearly 1,000 Azerbaijan settlements and contaminating 13% of our territory with 3 million landmines and unexploded ordnances. Yet Armenia, the perpetrator, receives funding, which it misuses for rearmament, while we are left unsupported. Finally, the OSCE must focus more on cooperation to build trust. Connectivity is a key area where it can play an active role. Azerbaijan, currently chairing the SICA and an active OSCE participant, is ready to foster Asia-Europe synergy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mamadon. And next speaker is Mrs. Milena Apostolaki from Greece, and she will be followed by Mr. Matti Raidma from Estonia.
Coming from Greece, one of the external borders of the European Union and the country with a long-standing stabilizing role in a challenging, to say the least, broader region, any discussion on security is of particular interest to us. The last 3 years turned out to be one of the biggest challenges to European resilience and unity. The return of war in Europe with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as well as major geopolitical shifts, have strained Europe's ability not only to promote its values, but to defend its interests as well. To navigate this shifting geopolitical landscape and avoid marginalization, Europe must redefine its place in the world. No longer can it rely on outdated assumptions or external guarantees of security and prosperity. Addressing the challenges of a multipolar world, rising populism and transnational threats requires Europe to move beyond technocratic solutions and embrace a renewed vision of shared purpose. Europe, already struggling to balance national interests in various fields, faces an even more complex challenge in the area of security. This fragmentation of threats makes it difficult to develop shared and coherent strategies in terms of defense spending, resource allocation, and cooperation among member states. Without a unified strategic vision and necessary structural reforms, Europe will become vulnerable to external threats and less effective in responding to international crises. In light of what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic, Europe must assume its responsibilities, come of age geopolitically, and take the issues of European defense very, very seriously, gaining great autonomy in the management of issues relating to common European defense. So let's work together, all of us, towards this joint critical endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Apostolaki. And next speaker is Mr. Matti Raidma from Estonia, who will be followed by Mr. Sargis Kandanian from Armenia.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, Europe is at crossroads. Global geopolitics are shifting in front of our eyes, and the OSCE is not untouched by it. Let us preserve the value of our basic principles, the Helsinki Declaration. Ukraine, we see a global fatigue of war, a global will to end fighting whatever cost. And unfortunately, some among us are ready to negotiate with the aggressor without Ukraine. This is probably the first time in history that the OSCE has taken a side and has not been just a platform for dialogue. The OSCE stands with Ukraine, stands for freedom, stands for just and lasting peace. It is highly concerning to know that there are plans in OSCE to visit an aggressor in Moscow. We have very strongly phrased our support for Ukraine, and we cannot waver in this. We must ensure that the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly will remain strong in supporting Ukraine until victory. We cannot tolerate unprovoked aggressions toward any of our members, and we cannot work together with today's Russia. Therefore, I ask of the OSCE to stand by its words. Keep Russia where it belongs, isolated and alone, and let's support Ukraine until we win. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Nothing about Europe without Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reidma. Next speaker is Mr. Sargis Kandanian from Armenia, who will be followed by Sir John Whittingdale from UK.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I would like to express my gratitude to the Ukrainian delegation for hosting members of the Assembly last week in Kiev. Our visit provided us with invaluable first-hand insight into the war and, most importantly, the severe humanitarian crisis it has caused. It goes without saying that Ukraine deserves a just and lasting peace, one that is firmly rooted in international law, the Helsinki principles, and the interest of the Ukrainian people. Dear colleagues, at a time when the rules-based international order faces serious challenges and uncertainties loom over the future of the OSCE region, we must seize every opportunity to resolve disputes and long-standing conflicts, especially where the prospect of peace is within reach. The South Caucasus is one such region where peace is not only possible but achievable. We cannot afford hesitation or delays in securing stability, and Armenia's position remains clear. Armenia is steadily pursuing peace. We are ready to sign a comprehensive peace agreement with Azerbaijan to establish lasting interstate relations. We are committed to unblocking regional communications and infrastructure, respecting the sovereignty and jurisdiction of each country. We stand ready to continue the ongoing process of border delimitation based on the agreed-upon regulations signed by both countries last year. We are prepared to engage in dialogue bilaterally to address all remaining issues of mutual concern, including humanitarian matters. My optimism extends to the normalization of relations between Armenia and Turkey as well. In fact, there are no significant obstacles preventing both countries from establishing diplomatic ties, opening borders, and fostering economic and trade cooperation. We are ready to take meaningful steps forward and await positive signals from Turkey. The groundwork for peace has been laid. Now it is essential to move beyond staged provocations and artificial escalations. Instead, we must work toward building institutional peace. Any delay is not just unacceptable. It's dangerous for the future of our entire region. Thank you.
Thank you, Sargis. Our next speaker is Sir John Whittingdale from the UK, and he will be followed by Ms. Monica Chaikova from North Macedonia.
Thank you, Madam President. European security that we are discussing this morning perhaps faces its greatest threat since the OSCE was founded 50 years ago. Yesterday, we discussed nuclear proliferation. One of the only countries ever to give up its nuclear weapons was Ukraine, and it did so with the guarantees of the United Kingdom, the USA, and also Russia, that they would respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Today, part of Ukraine is occupied by Russia, and the conflict continues, and Ukraine is losing more territory. All of the countries represented have given support to Ukraine. We remain supporting Ukraine, and we do so because we believe in the principles set out in the Helsinki Final Act, Ukraine is a democracy. I observed on behalf of this organization 3 elections in 2019 for the president and the parliament of Ukraine, and I saw the enthusiasm of the people of Ukraine for democracy. But it is not just in support of Ukraine. We are now all facing aggression from Russia, sabotage in the Baltic Sea, interference in elections, assassinations which have taken place in my country and others, disinformation. President Trump has set down a challenge which we need now to rise to. We do need to do more as European countries to defend ourselves by increasing expenditure on defense, to match those of the countries like Poland and the Baltic nations that have already done so. And we also need to look at other ways in which we can support Ukraine, particularly, as the G7 has suggested, by using the Russian assets that are frozen in Europe, and to take that money and to use it to help Ukraine to defend itself. Madam President, now more than ever, Russian aggression cannot be allowed to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whittingdale. Next speaker is Ms. Monica Tchaikova from North Macedonia, and she will be followed by Ms. Meritxell Lopez from Andorra.
Madam President, dear colleagues, the European security today faces serious challenges that require a united response from all of us. As member of the OSCPA, we have a responsibility to advocate the values of democracy, human rights, and peaceful conflict resolution. Our efforts must be directed towards strengthening parliamentary diplomacy, building trust between states, and promoting constructive dialogue. As the Russian Federation full-scale invasion of Ukraine continues to devastate the country for almost 3 years, the support for Ukraine must remain at the top of our political agenda. My country, the Republic of North Macedonia, firmly stands on the side of international law and condemns all acts of aggression. We support the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine and are part of the international sanctions against the aggressor. But in addition to solidarity, we must remain focused on the diplomatic efforts to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. The OSCE, as an organization with a long history of conflict mediation, should remain at the forefront of the search for solutions. What is happening these days is unacceptable. No one has a right to decide for no one's country without including them on the table. This is a dangerous precedent for the international law. Ladies and gentlemen, the uncertainty generated by the new policies of President Trump's administration creates additional challenges. The rhetoric of isolationism, the re-examination of multilateral agreements, and the policies that create uncertainty in transatlantic relations require us to strengthen partnership and remain committed to common security goals. In the end, I strongly believe that through joint parliamentary initiatives, we can contribute to resolving the most pressing issues for this European security. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Tchaikova. Next speaker is Ms. Meritxell Lopez from Andorra, and she will be followed by Mr. Costel Dunava from Romania.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear fellow parliamentarians, I would like to reiterate the need to address some fundamental issues that affect global security and the future of the region. Nuclear threats, the climate emergency, and cybersecurity. 3 issues that share the need for international cooperation, respect for international law, and commitment to stability and global security as a common denominator. First, regarding nuclear threats, we must remember the importance of preserving safety. Attacks on nuclear infrastructures are actions that pose a significant risk, not only for our region, but also for the world. We cannot allow nuclear energy to be used as a weapon for fear. As for the climate emergency, this has already been brought up in this parliamentary assembly, and we should continue to bring it up as a systemic risk. Climate stability is a key factor for human safety, well-being, economic development, and political stability. Climate change is not only a risk in itself, but also exacerbates other threats, fueling conflict and creating inequality and vulnerability. Finally, I want to express concern about the rise of the use of AI and how it impacts cybersecurity on a supranational, national, but also at an individual level. While it is clear that this rise in technology poses a new field of opportunities, it is also true that the risks are numerous and hard to predict. The increasing sophistication of such threats requires a swift and coordinated response as well as regulation. Despite the advancements and political commitments to AI regulation, in order to ensure data protection and fight AI misuse and misinformation, we are talking about technologies with a fast-paced development. This makes it hard for these regulations to keep up and poses a challenge that requires a stronger, coordinated and multilateral response to ensure the protection of our digital infrastructures, institutions, and especially citizens. This must be at the top of our political and legislative agendas. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. And the next speaker is Mr. Costel Dunava from Romania, and he will be followed by Mr. Daniel Fasler from Switzerland.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, the winter meeting of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly is taking place in a security context marked by Russia's unprovoked, unjustified and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, in blatant violation of the basic principle of international law, the UN Charter and OSCE commitments. We are regretfully approaching the end of the third year of Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine. We reiterate our firm call on the Russian Federation to immediately and unconditionally stop it and withdraw all its military forces and equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Continuous deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure by the Russian Federation, including on the ports at the Danube close to Ukraine's border with Romania, are atrocious. OSCE EPA remains we hold Russia to account for its violation of international humanitarian and human rights law, and therefore I welcome the firm position of the OSCE EPA President regarding Russia's war of aggression. Romania reiterates the unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, as well as for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on international law. We underline the principle that no initiative regarding Ukraine be taken without Ukraine, and also not without its neighbors, which have played and will continue to play a key role in supporting Ukraine. It is important to address the consequences for Russia's war of aggression, which are felt beyond Ukraine's borders. In this context, Romania will continue to provide all relevant support to the Republic of Moldova to strengthen its resilience in face of destabilizing activities by external actors and to support its European accession path. The PA should continue keeping a focus on resolving all existing conflicts and tensions. The situation in Ukrainian territories, legally and temporarily occupied by Russia, tragically mirrors the domestic situation in Russia itself, where the Russian legal system continues to be instrumentalized to serve the Kremlin's narrow interest. We reiterate the call for the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners in Russia. I want to thank also to Congressman Wilson for the exact radiography of presidential election from Romania. It's very important coming from a Republican. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunava. Dear colleagues, we only have 1 hour at our disposal. After 12 o'clock, we will have no interpretation. So if we go past that, it will only be in the language presented by the speaker. So I really urge you to stick to 2 minutes. So next speaker is Mr. Daniel Fasler from Switzerland, and he will be followed by Mr. Per Pons from Spain.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin, geschätzte Kolleginnen und Kollegen, wir feiern dieses Jahr das 50-Jahr-Jubiläum der KSZT-Schlussakte von Helsinki. Und was viele nicht wissen, der damaligen Konferenz in Helsinki gingen 2 Jahre Verhandlungen voraus, die in Genf geführt wurden, das heißt in der neutralen Schweiz. Europa war vor 50 Jahren keine heile Welt, im Gegenteil. Umso stärker war das Zeichen der Unterzeichnerstaaten die sich politisch, militärisch und wirtschaftlich teilweise in größter Feindschaft gegenüberstanden. Sie führten trotzdem den Dialog und schufen mit der Konferenz über Sicherheit und Zusammenarbeit in Europa eine Dialogplattform, die in den letzten 50 Jahren nicht alle Kriege verhindern konnte, aber viele Konflikte frühzeitig eindämmte oder in bessere, regelbasierte Bahnen lenkte. Die Unterzeichnerstaaten setzten vor 50 Jahren ein starkes Signal, indem sie sich zur Unverletzlichkeit der Grenzen, zur friedlichen Regelung von Streitfällen, zur Nichteinmischung in die inneren Angelegenheiten anderer Staaten sowie zur Wahrung der Menschenrechte und Grundfreiheiten verpflichtet hatten. An der Notwendigkeit, dass sich die OSZE-Staaten mit aller Ernsthaftigkeit diesen Zielen und Aufgaben annehmen, hat sich in den letzten 50 Jahren nichts geändert. Auch heute präsentieren sich Teile des OSZE-Gebietes leider nicht als heile Welt, im Gegenteil. Die Schweiz als neutraler Staat hat sich in den letzten 50 Jahren in der OSZE immer für den Dialog stark gemacht und auf ihrem Staatsgebiet schon viele Kriegs- und Konfliktparteien zu Gesprächen zusammengeführt. Dem Ziel, den Dialog auch in schwierigen Zeiten aufrechtzuerhalten, hat sich die Schweiz auch in den letzten 3 Jahren verschrieben. Die hochrangige Konferenz zum Frieden in der Ukraine, welche die Schweiz letzten Juni ausgetragen hatte, ist ein Beispiel der unermüdlichen diplomatischen Bemühungen der Schweiz. Dass sich alle Teilnehmerstaaten der OSZE dafür ausgesprochen haben, dass die Schweiz im nächsten Jahr zum 3. Mal den OSZE-Vorsitz übernehmen soll, ist ein großer Vertrauensbeweis. Unser Außenminister Ignazio Cassis, unser OSZE-Botschafter Raphael Nägeli und ihre Mitarbeitenden freuen sich darüber. Sie werden die ihnen übertragenen Aufgaben mit großem Engagement angehen. Damit die Präsidentschaft erfolgreich wird, ist die Schweiz auf die Unterstützung und die Dialogbereitschaft aller Teilnehmerstaaten angewiesen. Geschätzte Kolleginnen und Kollegen, die Delegation der Schweiz zählt dabei auch auf Sie. Vielen Dank für die Aufmerksamkeit.
Thank you, Mr. Fazler. Next speaker is Mr. Per Pons from Spain, and he will be followed by Mr. Pavel Bartoszek from Iceland.
Dear President, dear Pia, let me start addressing you personally, because I was a candidate in 2023 for the presidency, and you and I, we have been working in the last 2 years together in the Bureau, in all the meetings, and the most important thing to show the unity is that we have been working because we are liberals and we are Democrats. And I would like to underline that while there was a voice trying to divide us in Munich, you and the Bureau, you were in Ukraine, promoting democracy in Ukraine. This is what makes us valuable. This is the first point that I wanted to underline. Facts, not just words, because words matter. But the fact that you were in Ukraine last week, when they were trying to divide this capital, this is the added value of the organization. By the way, I would like to underline that the president of Spain will be in Kyiv on Monday, supporting the democracy of Ukraine, and of course, supporting President Zelensky. This, I think, it's extremely important. And this is the key. What is the elephant in the room? The elephant in the room is that the geopolitical chessboard is collapsing. So the response is unity, absolute unity. And then how to do it, how to do it. I think the first thing that I would like to say is that I was the head of the mission of the electoral observation in the US. And I would like to reiterate that in every observation, all the observers, all the MPs, all the people of the Secretariat do an excellent job in Uzbekistan, in Georgia, in the US, or whatever. I think we have to repeat it ourselves. This is why we are so important, because we are making difference on that. So I think this is the second point. And I think we have to support this observation. And by the way, I think it would be important to be in all elections, also, for example, in Romania, which is a key election that is coming. And just let me end that we need to work together to reinforce the governance of the last 2 years. We have to promote more work on the ground. And of course, we have to be only one voice. And I would like to reiterate that when I was listening to the Congressist Joe Wilson, I think that this is the way, that we are all united here, we are all liberals, and we are all promoting democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Per. The next speaker is Mr. Pavel Bartošek from Iceland, and he will be followed by Mr. Damian Ninuri from Albania.
Madam President, dear colleagues, Iceland stands firm to its commitment to transatlantic and European security and unwavering support for Ukraine. The world is facing a defining moment. We recognize the importance of standing with our allies against threats to democracy and sovereignty. Recent days have posed some difficult questions which demand difficult answers. Security is not free. Our Foreign Minister, Ms. Þorgerður Katrín Gunnarsdóttir, has emphasized that Iceland must significantly increase its contribution to security and defense. This is not just about military alliances, it is about safeguarding our shared values of freedom, stability, and cooperation. We have stood by Ukraine from day one. We need peace, just, sustainable, and long-lasting peace, not piecewise destruction of a sovereign European state. At the same time, we stress the importance of continued strong transatlantic ties, particularly with the United States, to ensure peace and stability in the entire Northern Hemisphere. Madam President, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bartošek. And the next speaker is Mr. Damian Nuri from Albania, and he will be followed by Mr. Zvonimir Troskot from Croatia.
Thank you, Madam President. As we gather here every year, we have the ability to measure the success of the progress of the most pressing security issues so far, even in our own speeches. Today, in contrast with the last year's meeting, there is a ceasefire and the beginning of a peace deal in Gaza and Lebanon. We all hope it will be the lasting one. We have been talking for many years about the war in Ukraine and how peace will be achieved. Some people thought it would be a complete victory without defining what it means. There is a new momentum now in regard to peace with the new Trump administration, yet the compromise should be endorsed by all sides for the durable peace. Despite the different views regarding how peace should be achieved, we have to work closely with the United States in ending this war and ensuring a durable peace. The OSCE role in strengthening the democratic institution, especially the election, is paramount. In particular, ODIHR is a prime in regard to this. We must not allow its role to wane or be left at the mercy of some governments to permit ODIHR to do this job. If that is permitted or considered as nothing has happened, it will be the beginning of the end of this very core mission of this organization. And we know very well, weak institution and erosion of rule of law means more insecurity. Albania will contribute with what it can for the security and peace, in particular in Southeast Europe area, where we think EU remains the only path for peace and prosperity in of the whole region. Finally, I invite all the members of this of OSCE to come and observe the elections in Albania planned for May 11 and to see with your own eyes the state of progress of institution and society of Albania. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nuri. And the next speaker is Mr. Zvonimir Troskot from Croatia, who will be followed by Ms. Özgür Saki from Turkey.
Honorable Chair, dear ladies and gentlemen, it is always difficult to hear remarks that challenge the status quo, particularly when they come from the Vice President of the world's most powerful nation. Yet, as hard as may be to admit, some of his points were undeniably accurate. Europe, once an economic powerhouse, is now struggling due to policies that have hurt its long-term interests. Weak energy and economic strategies have taken a toll, and as Mario Draghi recently noted in his report to the European Commission, Europe must rethink its approach to stay competitive and secure its future prosperity. Europe faces a demographic crisis with an aging population and low birth rates. Mass migration hasn't solved the problem. We need family-friendly policies to secure a stable future and keep Europe a place where people want to live, work, and invest. Freedom of speech is not just a principle, it's the foundation of any free society. When governments or powerful institutions silence dissenting voices, they aren't protecting democracy, they're undermining it. True freedom means allowing debate even when it is uncomfortable, because without it, we risk losing the very liberties that define us. The challenges Europe faces today are significant, but not insurmountable. By focusing on pragmatic, evidence-based solutions, we can restore Europe's security, rebuild its economy, preserve freedom of speech, and ensure a stable future for generations to come. Europe must act decisively and regain its strength. The moment to act is upon us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Troscott. The next speaker is Ms. Özgür Saki from Turkey, who will be followed by Emanuele Loperfido from Italy.
Thanks. Dear colleagues, what is being discussed is the security of the member states of the European Union. It is a problem not only for Europe, but for the whole world. We cannot deny this fact. The security problem of Europe and the whole world is as much an outcome as it's a problem. To a large extent, it is outcome of Europe's own policies, which manifest themselves as a security problem all over the world. In this sense, the security problem is a symptom of disease. The disease should be treated, not the symptoms. Europe trades arms all over the world. That is, it directly enables wars. Europe either supports or turns a blind eye to imperialist policies. In other words, Europe prevents the development of democracy in the world in terms of self-governance of peoples. As seen most recently after the overthrow of the regime in Syria, Europe debates with political movements that are directly opposite to its ideological views, without any criticism or political pressure, as long as it suits it. Europe passes laws to prevent refugees from entering Europe as a result of the problem it has caused. It tries to prevent terrorist attacks by various efforts to monitor and control almost everyone it can, including its own citizens, using all the technology at its disposal. These are the actions to treat the symptoms, but where is the solution to the disease? In learning from history and realizing that security is possible through peace, not armaments. In embracing the right of peoples to self-determination and in striving for the realization of is right by all people in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Saki. And the next speaker is Emanuele Leperfido from Italy, who will be followed by Ms. Alexandra Ustinova from Ukraine.
Gentile Presidente, cari colleghi, quanto accaduto a Monaco di Baviera, a Villach, l'arresto avvenuto a Vienna 2 giorni fa di un 14enne con la bandiera dell'ISIS appesa in camera che aveva pianificato un attacco alla stazione ferroviaria della città di Vienna sono segnali inquietanti. A questi si aggiunge il preoccupante e terrificante annuncio pubblicato ieri sul sito internet dell'ISIS che incita a imitare gli attacchi con l'auto come a Monaco di Baviera, a Villach o a Nizza contro la folla nelle città europee, indicandole quasi come obiettivi militari. Berlino, Monaco di Baviera, Francoforte, Vienna, Bruxelles, Anversa, Salisburgo. Questi gli obiettivi dell'ISIS. Tutto questo dimostra che non dobbiamo più considerare ogni singolo attacco come il gesto isolato di un folle o di un cosiddetto lupo solitario. Dietro questi atti c'è una strategia precisa, alimentata nell'ombra da chi sfrutta internet e l'intelligenza artificiale, nelle tenebre causate da povertà e fragilità delle istituzioni, per minacciare la sicurezza delle nostre democrazie e lanciare attacchi terroristici. Per questo motivo riprendendo il lavoro già illustrato dal Presidente del Comitato, Kamil Aydin, che ringrazio, dobbiamo valorizzare e supportare l'azione del Comitato. È fondamentale potenziare il nostro impegno e mettere al centro della priorità della nostra organizzazione e dei nostri paesi il tema della cyber security, la regolamentazione dell'intelligenza artificiale e il suo utilizzo per contrastarne gli impieghi malevoli. Dobbiamo lavorare insieme, dobbiamo lavorare per contrastare i predicatori di odio, prevenire gli attacchi di chi vuole mettere a rischio la nostra stabilità e i nostri valori. Dobbiamo farlo per noi, per i nostri paesi, per la nostra democrazia, per il nostro futuro di pace e stabilità.
Thank you, Mr. Loperfido. And next speaker is Ms. Alexandra Ustinova from Ukraine, who will be followed by Ms. Irina Gerashenko from Ukraine. So, Ms. Irina Gerashenko, you have the floor, and after you, there will be Ms. Lilit Galstian from Armenia.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleague, we are meeting here after the Munich Security Conference at a time when the world has entered a new geopolitical reality. Europe is also in a new geopolitical reality on the demand to wake up and mobilize immediately. Unfortunately, since 2014, Europe has ignored Ukraine's warning about the real threats posed by Russia. Right now, we are in a situation where Putin is close to achieving what he has always wanted. He has long spoken of reducing the US presence in Europe. He is actively working to undermine the unity of the EU and NATO. He wants Ukraine to pay for a so-called compromise with its territory and sovereignty. It would be a grave mistake if Putin gets what he wants even before peace negotiations begin. Unpunished, evil always return. Russia must be held accountable for all its crimes. It must pay reparation. Frozen Russia assets must be used to cover its cost of Western aid. We insist that Ukraine and Europe must have a seat at the negotiation table. The key principle must not be violated. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Our territory and sovereignty cannot be a compromise. Ukraine must receive real, firm, effective, and long-term security guarantees. It's very important to Ukraine, about Ukraine and Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Gerashenko. And next speaker is Ms. Lilit Galstian from Armenia, who will be followed by Luis Graça from Portugal.
Madam President, dear colleagues, we are all witnesses to the making of a new world architecture which requires that the strategy and the mechanism of international organizations be reviewed. Many in my country are questioning the impact and role of the international organizations, including the OSCE and its Parliamentary Assembly, believing that we have gone back on our values and commitments. We have to be frank and speak up about the increasing gap between the rhetoric and the reality, between statements and the policies on the ground that are breeding hopelessness and disappointment. Nearly 2 years have passed since the forced displacement of ethnic Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. Disregarding the international resolutions, Azerbaijan launched an act of ethnic cleansing, forcing its indigenous population, more than 120,000 Armenians, to leave the ancestral land. The OSCE, Minsk Group, and other organizations have failed to hold Azerbaijan accountable for its genocidal actions and breach of international law. No measures have been taken to ensure the safe return of the displaced population to their homeland of 3,000 years. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan continues to erase the Armenian cultural and religious heritage of the region. It is hard to believe that genocide has become the new normality in our times. Today, behind closed doors, in violation of the international humanitarian law, Baku is conducting mock trials against the civilian captives and the former political and military leaders of Artsakh. The right to legal defense has been severely obstructed. There are proven reports on torture and the denial of basic legal protections. In this regard, I call my esteemed colleagues, the Human Rights Rapporteur and the Special Representative on South Caucasus to take immediate and strong steps on this matter. Allowing Azerbaijan to act with impunity erodes the credibility of the international legal system. Dear colleagues, I would like to highlight the urgency of deploying an OSCE-PA monitoring group to Baku to document human rights violations in Azerbaijan, particularly the illegal detainment of Nagorno-Karabakh state and military officials. Respective letters have been sent on the matter. I strongly believe that commitment to declared values is the basis of good and moral policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Galstian. Next speaker is Mr. Luis Grasa from Portugal, who will be followed by Ms. Rian Vogels from Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear friends, we are entering the domain of the unknown. Will the USA second Europe in face of the Pacific and put NATO into sleep? Or all these noises part of President Trump's commercial strategy for Europe to increase its investment in defense industry and give up regulation to the American business activity in new technologies and the richest men in the world? Perhaps the reality is a little of the two. But after the threat of annexation of Greenland and Canada, the threat to establish trade taxes on European products, the speeches of support for the European extreme right, the real estate intentions on Gaza, and finally, the beginning of negotiations on peace in Ukraine, directly with Putin, without Ukraine, and without Europe, what is not acceptable, make us fear profound geopolitical changes and concessions whose price can be very high, especially among old friends and allies. The replacement of globalization by the blocization of the world will have very negative effects. Dear friends, trade agreements are better than custom duties. The free movement of people and goods does more for security and peace than walls. Dialogue, multiculturalism is better than isolation. The force of law is better than the law of the force. My dear American friends, we are grateful for the efforts of the US has made to ensure Europe's security on the past 70 years, and we do not reject that Europe needs as a whole to assume a more active role in its own defense. And we, Europeans, have to do it together as a nation of nations, not allowing this critical moment to be the beginning of the fragmentation of Europe, and that collective negotiation and the mutualization of responsibilities, duties and costs gives way to bilateral bargain or groups of countries in detriment of others. The darkest moments in the history of the European continent, or more recently, the fight against the COVID pandemic and the 3 years of Russian war in Ukraine, teach us that only united we can overcome crisis and offer peace and prosperity to our citizens. We admire America, and we want America to stand with us side by side for freedom and democracy. So like President Ronald Reagan said back in Berlin, '87, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I humbly ask our American friends to join us today in a new call from Vienna. Mr. Trump, let's build bridges, not walls. Madam President, long live to Helsinki Final Act principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Next speaker is Ms. Rian Vogels from the Netherlands, and she will be followed by Mr. Artemi Rayo from Spain.
Madam Chair, we stand at a pivotal moment in history where our collective response will shape the future of Europe and beyond. The war in Ukraine is not merely a conflict within its borders, it is a test of our shared values of freedom, democracy, and human dignity. We express our unwavering solidarity with President Zelensky and the courageous people of Ukraine, who have shown remarkable resilience and determination in the face of unprovoked aggression. It's been said before, and it cannot be stressed enough. Ukraine's fight is our fight. Allowing aggression to prevail would undermine the very principle that OSCE stands for: respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the rule of law. Now is the time for unity and to contribute to whatever you can. Our strength lies in our ability to stand together, transcending political differences to defend our shared values. We must not lose ourselves now in all sorts of discussions about how Europe should be organized. We can have faith in our own strength, in our own way. History has shown that when Europe stands united, we can overcome even the greatest of threats. Let us work collectively to provide Ukraine with the support it needs, militarily, economically, and humanitarily. And at the same time, let us intensify diplomatic efforts to seek a just and lasting peace. The eyes of the world are upon us, and the decisions we make today will shape the world that future generations inherit. We owe it to them to stand firm in our principles, to defend the values that define us, and to ensure that freedom and justice prevail. In a Europe where all nations can live in peace, freedom, and security. A Europe where borders are respected, human rights are upheld, and conflicts are resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vogels. Our next speaker is Mr. Artemir Rayo from Spain, who will be followed by Ms. Gisèle Jourdan from France.
Thank you, dear President, dear colleagues. Democracy is under threat here in Europe and in North America too. The founding principles of the OSCE are at risk. The democratic culture of human rights is regressing by more than a century. The international order is giving way to the brute force of the most powerful nations. To the humankind's shame, we are witnessing the return of mass deportations, internment in concentration camps, raids on foreign people, denunciations, statelessness, xenophobia, racism, denial of sexual diversity, the rule of the strong, the rule of the jungle. This organization cannot remain impassive in face of this new fascism. The rise of the far right threatens democratic values and multilateral international order. Democracy must fight against its enemies. Democracy must defend against itself against the enemies. Indifference or cowardice only paves the way for autocrats and tyranny. The OSCE must reaffirm its values and demand that all its members uphold respect for democratic values as the foundation of order and peace. Security and peace can only be built on respect for human dignity and the right of peoples to exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rayo. And the next speaker is Ms. Gisèle Jourdan from France, who will be followed by Mr. Kamil Aydin from Turkey.
Madame la Présidente, chers collègues, dans ce débat sur les défis prioritaires de la sécurité en Europe, j'ai la conviction que la guerre d'agression russe en Ukraine constituera l'acte de naissance ou bien de mort de la sécurité européenne. Cela passe, selon moi, par l'édification d'une véritable défense européenne. Tant que nous ne clarifierons pas ce que notre politique de défense commune est censée représenter au sein de la construction européenne, nous ne serons pas en mesure de comprendre ce que l'Union doit faire et ce qu'elle ne doit pas faire. Nous devons renforcer notre coopération en matière de défense, surmonter à cette fin les divergences nationales, mettre en place des mécanismes de décision plus efficaces. La dimension diplomatique de notre action essentielle, renforcer notre présence, notre influence sur la scène internationale s'impose, en particulier dans les régions où les intérêts européens sont en jeu, tels que les pays du partenariat oriental qui sont en première ligne. L'Ukraine, la Moldavie ont réalisé des efforts incontestables pour se rapprocher de l'UE, faire partie intégrante de l'architecture de sécurité de l'Europe face à la menace globale que constitue la Russie. Où va la Géorgie? Elle est aujourd'hui prise en étau par les ingérences de la Russie avec les troupes russes stationnées sur ses territoires occupés d'Abkhazie et d'Ossétie. Souhaitons que les forces politiques géorgiennes pourront revenir au dialogue et que la démocratie enfin prévaudra. Face aux menaces hybrides qui combinent les éléments militaires et non militaires, nous devons renforcer la résilience de nos infrastructures critiques. Mieux protéger nos réseaux de communication, lutter contre la désinformation, promouvoir une culture de la sécurité. La Géorgie, la Moldavie, même la Roumanie ont été sévèrement touchées par cette guerre hybride. Je m'inquiète également des effets que cela pourrait avoir sur les résultats des élections législatives allemandes de ce week-end. Nous appelons de nos vœux une Europe en paix et en sécurité, d'est en ouest et du nord au sud. La défense européenne faite par et pour les Européens en sera garante. La POSCE doit jouer tout son rôle pour impulser ces lignes directrices. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Ms. Jourdan. And the next speaker is Mr. Kamil Aydin from Turkey, who will be followed by Mr. Mark Visi from the United States.
Honorable Madam President and distinguished colleagues, today we face a security environment shaped by geopolitical conflicts, terrorism, irregular migration, and cybersecurity threats. As my dear friend Emmanuel has already indicated, these challenges are transnational, constantly evolving, and demand collective action. Terrorism remains one of the greatest threats to our societies. Terrorist organizations continue to exploit political instability, economic hardship, and technological advancements to spread their ideologies and carry out attacks. Europe must adopt a firm and unified stance against all forms of terrorism without selective approaches. Differentiating between terrorist groups or using one to eliminate another undermines our collective security and emboldens these networks. Turkey has been on the front lines of the fight against terrorism for decades. We combat groups such as PKK, FETÖ, and Daesh, which not only threaten Turkey but also pose serious security risks to Europe. These organizations engage in recruitment, financing, and propaganda across borders. To dismantle these networks, we need coordinated intelligence sharing, stricter financial controls, and stronger legal frameworks. At the same time, stability in the Middle East is critical for Europe's security. In the light of developments following the overthrow of the Ba'athist regime in Syria, Turkey remains determined to eliminate the PKK, PYD, IPG terrorist organization and its extensions, which have no place in Syria's future. We expect decisive action against this ruthless terrorist group, which has been conducting an increasingly aggressive propaganda campaign across Europe. On the other hand, extremist ideologies thrive in environments of division and marginalization. Preventing radicalization requires investment in education, social cohesion, and counter-narratives to extremist propaganda. The digital space has become a battleground for recruitment and misinformation. Therefore, cooperation with technology companies and civil society is crucial to countering extremist narratives online. In conclusion, terrorism and extremism cannot be defeated in isolation. They are among the most pressing challenges to European security. We must strengthen our international cooperation, eliminate double standards in countering terrorism efforts, and address the root causes of radicalization. Turkey stands ready to work with its partners to build a safer and more secure Europe. Thank you. Bir buçuk dakika mı, 2,5 dakika? Ha.
Thank you, Mr. Aydin. Dear colleagues, I still have more than 20 names on the list and we only have 20 minutes left, officially speaking. So from the next speaker on, I would like to ask you to limit your speech to 1.5 minutes if possible. And the next speaker is Mr. Mark Visi from the United States, who will be followed by Mr. Pavlo Frolov from Ukraine.
Oh, went off there. I also want to note that Representative Steve Cohen from Tennessee couldn't be here today, but that he is very concerned about everything that's happening in the Ukraine, and he has issued a statement that will be left outside of the door for everyone to get a copy of. And the last full day of this meeting, Madam President, I just want to remind everyone here that as we get ready to go back home to our respective states and our families and our children, that what the Ukrainian people are experiencing right now is very real and something that we have not seen in this world for a long time. The human rights abuses, the abolishing of freedom of religion, the censoring that's taken place, everything that Putin and the Russian regime is doing to harm our friends in Ukraine is very real. And we must continue to band together and work together to stop it because it won't end in Ukraine. It will spread throughout the rest of Europe and will destabilize this world. And I just want to remind everyone that the things that we work on here are real. And that we have got to continue to band together, no matter how long it takes, to make sure that we keep that war criminal Vladimir Putin out of Ukraine forever and that Ukraine has its sovereignty. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Visi. The next speaker is Mr. Pavlo Frolov from Ukraine, who will be followed by Mr. Angelos Syrigos from Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, Russia's war has displaced near 5 million people inside Ukraine and forced 7 million to seek refuge abroad. As of December 2023, 4 million Ukrainians lost their homes. Total housing losses estimated at 55 billion euro. This was before another year of war, further deepening the housing crisis. Rebuilding at pre-war rates would take at least a decade. Without a coordinated strategy, millions will remain displaced, fueling economic instability and further migration beyond Ukraine's borders. To address this, Ukraine is launching a housing register for IDPs, an interactive digital platform that will map available housing and its condition in real time, help municipalities, donors, and humanitarian organizations coordinate housing efforts and provide a transparent framework for developers to invest in social housing. UNHCR is already supporting housing register development, but we need further legislative, technical, and financial backing. How can OSCE member states support this effort? First, recognize the housing register as a key tool for recovery and reintegration. Second, encourage donors to channel housing aid through the register for transparency and efficiency. Third, provide legal and technical expertise to support full implementation. Fourth, help returning Ukrainians by linking them with available housing solutions. This is not just a Ukrainian issue. A stable Ukraine means a stable Europe. Housing is a pillar of recovery, and together we can turn displacement into reintegration, destruction into reconstruction, and crisis into resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frolov. Next speaker is Mr. Angelos Syrigos from Greece, and he will be followed by Mr. Oscar Mina from San Marino.
Thank you very much. We live in a time when the things we take for granted can change suddenly. This uncertainty can be unsettling, but is not necessarily a bad thing. The greatest challenge facing our continent today is the ongoing war in Ukraine. This war has shattered two long-standing assumptions. War will never return to Europe. And if war does break out, it will be over in a matter of weeks. Before going further, it is important to remember how it all began. Russia launched the war by invading Ukraine 3 years ago, attacking from the east, the north, including from Belarus, and the south via occupied Crimea. It was an act of unprovoked aggression against a sovereign state. In the first weeks of the invasion, Russia failed in its primary objective, the capture of Kyiv. Nevertheless, it now occupies approximately 20% of Ukraine's territory. Were mistakes made by the countries that supported Ukraine? One could argue that we did not exhaust every possible means to end the war. Any ceasefire is preferable to continued bloodshed. Moreover, the longer the conflict drags on, the greater the risk of escalation, even to the point of nuclear confrontation. That said, just as it takes two to tango, it takes two to negotiate. I'm not talking about negotiating just a ceasefire, but rather negotiating a lasting peace agreement. In the months ahead, we will be forced to ask truly radical questions and make difficult choices. Ladies and gentlemen, a ship reaches its destination only if it has a compass. Our compass is our principles. Our principles and our strength comes from upholding values that our people believe in: freedom, dialogue, pluralism, rule of law, and standing together against tyranny. We must always remember that we do not seek a ruthless world where only the strongest survive. We reject the outdated great power doctrine that might makes right. The OSCE cannot abandon the core principles enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act, these being refraining from the use of force, the inviolability of borders, and the territorial integrity of states. More importantly, we must agree on two fundamental points. There can be no lasting solution for Ukraine without Ukraine. There can be no solution for Europe's security without Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sirikos. Now, dear friends, I will have to ask you to cut in half the speech that you were supposed to make because of the time limit that we have. The next speaker on my list is Mr. Oscar Mina from San Marino, and he will be followed by Ms. Anna Bilotti from Italy.
Grazie Presidente. Una delle aree di sfide nel campo della sicurezza europea sulla quale vorrei brevemente soffermarmi è la disinformazione e la sua propaganda nella manipolazione delle fake news. Il tema della disinformazione e della sua propaganda non è da sottovalutare. Credo che sia importante che questa Assemblea ne prenda atto affinché diventi una delle prerogative in termini di cooperazione sulla sicurezza contro la diffusione di notizie fuorvianti e destabilizzanti e sulle condizioni veritiere del conflitto in Ucraina, sia sotto l'aspetto geopolitico che sotto l'aspetto della sicurezza stessa della regione OSCE. Infatti la diffusione di notizie non veritiere propagandate come corrette di regime da parte di Putin, quindi controllate dalla Russia e dai social e testate giornalistiche pro-regime, rappresentano a prescindere una minaccia transnazionale alla quale l'OSCE deve porre una certa attenzione affinché in Europa, nei parlamenti nazionali, vi sia la volontà di adottare legislazioni in merito che tutelino certamente la libertà di informazione dei media e della carta stampata, ma ne egual misura, mantenere alta l'attenzione evitando ogni forma discriminante nella diffusione di una falsa informazione manipolata su come si evolve il conflitto in Ucraina. Concludo e voglio ribadire ancora una volta che la disinformazione rappresenta una minaccia particolare per la nostra democrazia e sicurezza e disinnescarla credo sia una delle sfide e compito della nostra organizzazione. Grazie Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Mina. And the next speaker is Ms. Anna Bilotti from Italy, and she will be followed by Mr. Eurico Brilhante Diaz from Portugal.
Presidente, colleghi parlamentari, rappresentanti degli Stati membri dell'OSCE, il rispetto del diritto internazionale e la sicurezza europea sono temi che toccano il cuore del nostro impegno comune. La sicurezza europea non può essere perseguita soltanto attraverso strategie di deterrenza. Un ordine globale si costruisce con rispetto delle regole, con la certezza del diritto e con istituzioni capaci di garantire che i crimini più gravi non restino impuniti. Il recente caso dell'arresto e del successivo rilascio di un individuo accusato di crimini gravissimi dalla Corte Penale Internazionale solleva questioni fondamentali sulla coerenza con cui gli Stati membri attuano gli obblighi derivanti dagli accordi internazionali. Comprendiamo tutti che ogni Stato ha la responsabilità di tutelare la propria sicurezza nazionale. Tuttavia, il rispetto del diritto internazionale e la collaborazione tra le istituzioni nazionali e quelle sovranazionali sono indispensabili affinché le decisioni in materia di giustizia non diventino atti discrezionali, soggetti a valutazioni di opportunità politica. L'OSCE, nel suo ruolo di garante della stabilità e della sicurezza, può e deve favorire un confronto costruttivo fra gli Stati membri per rafforzare la cooperazione con la Corte Penale Internazionale. L'adozione di protocolli chiari per l'esecuzione dei mandati della Corte Penale Internazionale e il consolidamento del coordinamento fra Stati membri e istituzioni sovranazionali sono passi fondamentali per garantire l'affidabilità e la coerenza del diritto internazionale. Il principio della responsabilità penale internazionale deve essere una priorità e non una variabile dipendente dalle contingenze politiche. Grazie.
Thank you, Ms. Bilotti. And the next speaker is Mr. Eurico Brilhante Diaz from Portugal, and he will be followed by Mr. Christos Senekis from Cyprus.
Dear President, dear delegates, dangerous times. We are facing dangerous times. Our friends from the United States have elected a president which is taking steps which are worsening a difficult situation. Russian Federation is attacking the international law fundamentals. Ukraine is suffering an aggression and is fighting for sovereignty, self-determination and freedom. We need to say President Zelensky is a democrat, is not a dictator. And Mr. Putin is clearly a dictator. So we need to remain united, defending our values. We should not choose between war and dishonor. It will be a terrible choice. Nevertheless, a sustainable peace in Europe needs fairness and values. The defeat of Ukraine would be our own defeat. Freedom and democracy, free elections, sovereign countries based on people's free will. It is our common ground. We need to be prepared to fight and defend that common ground, and OSCEPA, following the Helsinki Final Act principles, is a platform for that consensus where a consensus can be reached. I need to stress, next Monday, Mr. Costa and Mrs. von der Leyen are going to be in Ukraine, supporting Ukraine. It's our support. Slava Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz. The next speaker is Mr. Christos Senekis from Cyprus, and he will be followed by Ms. Anna Pick from France.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, significant geopolitical shifts are already very visible and were expressed very clearly, particularly at the recent Munich Security Conference and the Riyadh negotiations. In Ukraine, the war has already lasted 3 years. Since day one, we voiced our support for a just and comprehensive peace deal, grounded in the UN Charter and international law principles. As the future of peace in Ukraine is being discussed, Europe's increased autonomy in security affairs is definitely a priority challenge in view of the intensifying great power competition. At the same time, Europe being sidelined from negotiations on Ukraine's future is sending wrong signals. EU member states have contributed militarily as well as financially and shouldered the economic and diplomatic cost for implementing sanctions. Dear colleagues, European security faces additional security challenges in its neighborhood. Across the region, we are seeing a reshaping of the Middle East, but the end result is still unclear. In Syria, after years of bloodshed, new institutions have been established. We support a Syrian-owned political transition towards a democratic and legitimate government from which no ethnic or religious community will be excluded, and will prepare a constitutional reform and lead to elections without foreign interference. We also very much hope to see Syria promoting good neighborly relations and fully complying with international law, including the international law of the sea. In Gaza, the ceasefire and hostage release deal has been a very positive development, and we will continue to advocate a two-state solution in line with the previous agreements and in full conformity to relevant UN resolutions. A final agreement that will guarantee Israel's security as well as the inalienable right of Palestinians to return to Gaza to rebuild their homes and their lives, since legitimate inhabitants must have the right to their property, be it in Gaza or in Varosha in occupied Cyprus. Concerning Cyprus, the President of the Republic of Cyprus is exerting every possible effort to achieve a restart of negotiations to solve the Cyprus problem. An extended meeting in Geneva is planned for next month to discuss with the Turkish Cypriot leader as well as Turkey, Greece, and the UK. President Christodoulidis has also submitted very specific proposals in this regard, aiming to facilitate the restart of negotiations. We are very much hope that Turkey and the Turkish Cypriot side will abandon their rhetoric for two-state solution and proceed to negotiations to find a lasting solution within the agreed framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Senekis. I now have to limit your speaking time to 1 minute because I still have several names on the list and we are soon over time. So the next speaker is Ms. Anna Pick from France, and she will be followed by Ms. Federica Honori from Italy.
Merci Madame la Présidente. L'intelligence artificielle ne représente pas seulement un défi pour nos démocraties, mais elle redéfinit nos stratégies militaires et nos équilibres géopolitiques. En Ukraine, l'IA a progressivement été développée et intégrée dans les systèmes de drones de reconnaissance et de drones kamikazes, permettant d'opérer dans des environnements saturés de brouillage électronique, de s'adapter à des conditions difficiles et de poursuivre les opérations même en cas de perte de signal avec l'opérateur ou les données GPS. Dans la bande de Gaza, l'armée israélienne a intensifié son recours à des programmes d'IA, deuxième génération, privilégiant une intervention rapide et massive au détriment d'un ciblage précis. Initialement conçus comme de simples appareils téléguidés, les drones se sont métamorphosés en systèmes semi-autonomes capables d'accomplir des missions complexes et létales. L'Ukraine et la bande de Gaza se sont transformés en laboratoires à ciel ouvert pour la maîtrise de cette nouvelle technologie, devenue un défi pour les armées, pour notre sécurité, mais aussi pour le droit international. En effet, les SALA sont des systèmes qui ont la capacité de sélectionner et d'engager une force létale grâce à l'analyse de capteurs sans intervention humaine directe. Ces systèmes d'armes soulèvent dès lors des questions fondamentales d'ordre éthique, humanitaire, juridique, opérationnel, moral et sécuritaire. La prolifération des robots-tueurs et l'autonomisation des champs de bataille constituent une menace pour le droit international humanitaire et pour la protection des civils. Ces systèmes d'armes soulèvent également la question de la responsabilité. Les opérateurs humains seront-ils tenus responsables d'actions entreprises par des systèmes autonomes qu'ils ne pouvaient ni prévoir ni contrôler? Face à cette évolution où les machines font la guerre, la question de la régulation se pose. Devons-nous attendre? Non. Il faut trouver une manière d'encadrer ces armes, de redonner à l'humain une place centrale comme nous avons été capables de les faire pour les mines antipersonnelles. Il en va de notre sécurité européenne, mais également de la vie de nos concitoyens. Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Pick. And the next speaker is Ms. Federica Onori from Italy, and she will be followed by Senator Mohamed Iqbal Ravalia from Canada.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to use this space I have today to accept the invitation from Vladimir and Evgenia Kara-Murza, who have been with us these past days to emphasize the importance of publicly speaking out about political prisoners. It is important to mention them by name and tell their stories so that they are not forgotten in prison and so that they are not, and their families don't feel abandoned. Today, I want to highlight the case of Hugo Marino Salas, an Italian-Venezuelan citizen who disappeared in Caracas, Venezuela, 5 years ago. And if you allow me, I will speak in Spanish as a tribute to Hugo's mother, Beatriz Salas, who has never given up on knowing what happened to her son. El ingeniero Hugo Marino Salas tenía una empresa especializada en recuperaciones, particularmente de aeronaves desaparecidas en el aire. Como intermediario del gobierno italo-venezolano, Hugo coordinó en junio de 2013 la operación que condujo al descubrimiento del avión Missoni, que se estrelló frente a la costa de Los Roques. Sin embargo, el 20 de abril de 2019, Hugo Marino, un hombre que pasó su vida buscando desaparecidos, también desapareció en Venezuela. Según relatos familiares, fue secuestrado por la fuerza por agentes de inteligencia militar del régimen de Maduro. Hoy, Hugo Marino sigue desaparecido. Maduro no nos dice dónde está retenido. Maduro no nos dice en qué condiciones se encuentra. Maduro no nos dice si sigue vivo. Su caso ha sido denunciado ante la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, que impuso medidas cautelares el año de su desaparición. Por lo tanto, expreso nuestra solidaridad en nombre de la Asamblea Parlamentaria de la OSCE, si se me permite, a Hugo Marino y su familia. Hugo Marino, esté donde esté, debe saber que el mundo no lo ha olvidado, que sigue pidiendo verdad y justicia, que sigue al lado de su madre, Beatriz. Gracias.
Microphone, please. Thank you, Ms. Onori. The next speaker is Senator Mohamed Iqbal Ravalia from Canada, and he will be followed by Mrs. Fatalieva from Azerbaijan.
Are being tested by geopolitical tensions, emerging threats, and evolving alliances. In this landscape, the OSCE remains essential in promoting dialogue, stability, and cooperation. Transatlantic security is undergoing significant shifts. Discussions at the Munich Security Conferences highlighted the need for European nations to enhance their defense capabilities while reinforcing transatlantic cooperation, including our shared commitments to sovereignty, peace, and security. Canada is a reliable and engaged partner in this effort. Our commitment to NATO, the OSCE, and European security is unwavering. We continue to strengthen deterrence, support Ukraine's resilience, and contribute to the stability of the broader security framework. The moment also presents an opportunity for Europe to further develop its defense capabilities. Canada welcomes these efforts, recognizing that a stronger Europe reinforces, not weakens, our transatlantic alliance. Security today extends beyond military readiness. It requires resilience against disinformation, economic coercion, and cyber threats. Canada remains committed to working with our allies to counter these challenges through intelligence sharing, capacity building, and safeguarding democratic institutions. Canada will continue to work closely with partners to reinforce the principles of a rule-based order. Let us reaffirm our partnerships, strengthen our collective capabilities, and ensure that our security framework remains robust, enduring, and aligned with our shared values. Canada stands with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ravalia. For your information, from now on, I will ring the bell when 1 minute's time is up. So next speaker is Ms. Fatalieva from Azerbaijan, and she will be followed by Mr. Boris Dittrich from the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, European security today faces a range of challenges, from military conflict to humanitarian crisis. Azerbaijan remains fully committed to peace, security, and regional stability, and we believe that sustainable peace can only be achieved through dialogue, mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and adherence to international law. One of the most pressing security concerns in our region is the aftermath of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The liberated territories of Azerbaijan remain among the most mine-contaminated areas in the world, severely hindering post-conflict reconstruction, safe return of displaced people. Since the signing of the trilateral statement in 2020, 382 additional mine-related incidents have occurred, resulting in 70 fatalities and 312 injuries. Despite its obligation, Armenia has provided only partial and inaccurate minefield maps. 55% of mine explosions have occurred in the areas not covered by the data provided. And even more concerning is evidence that Armenia continued to plant mines after the cessation of hostilities. And finally, I would like to remind our colleague, Madam Galstian, that it's time to accept the reality. There is no Artsakh, there is only Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, and there was no ethnic cleansing of Armenian population of Karabakh, who was provided the protection, ensured the protection of their rights and integration into society. But following the call of Armenian leadership, they choose to leave the region themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fatalieva. And the next speaker is Mr. Boris Dittrich from the Netherlands, and he will be followed
Dear
by
colleagues, allow me to share some personal impressions from my visit to Kiev, Ukraine last week. Shortly before we entered the Parliament building, a missile, a ballistic missile, was shot to the Parliament building. It was a North Korean manufactured missile. And it's crazy to think that North Koreans are fighting in Europe, on European soil, against Ukraine, a European country. During the meetings, we heard the message over and over again, and I fully support it: no peace without the consent and the participation of Ukraine. And the same goes, of course, also for Europe. During our visit, we also spoke with a family member of the OSCE, one of the employees who were arrested and sentenced to 14 and 13 years imprisonment on bogus charges by the Russians. And they need to be freed as soon as possible. They are in detention already from 2022 while they were working for us, the OSCE member states. And I'd like to mention their names: Vadim Golda, Maxim Petrov, and Dmitro Shabanov. And lastly, I would like to say that I will remember and never forget that old woman in her winter's coat who came to the bus when we were about to leave her village, where hundreds of men were shot down by the Russian army while they were defending their village. And she called to us, "Help us, help us." And Madam Chair, we will. Slava Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Dittrich. And the next speaker is Mr. Yevrosim Pejovic from Montenegro, and he will be followed by Mr. Ludovic Hayev from France.
Thank you. Dear fellow colleagues, I grew up in former Yugoslavia surrounded by war. As a child, I believed that powerful nations whose name sounds almost divine would one day intervene and rescue us from political oppression, from bombs, from madness. Years later, I came to realize the hard truth. No one was coming. The responsibility to change our destiny lays with us alone. This applies not only to individuals, but to the nations as well. For small states like Montenegro, security and domestic stability not come from waiting for salvation, but from taking charge of our own future. This is why we anchor ourselves in multilateral frameworks, NATO, the OSCE, and the rule-based international order. Those institutions are the foundation of our security. When Europe's security architecture was challenged, we stood firm in our commitment to multilateralism. We cannot afford to be left on the sideline in this security conundrum. Montenegro is an indivisible part of Europe, and our voice, like the voices of all European nations, must be heard. After the devastation of World War II, we built multilateral institutions as a platform to address even the most complex and delicate challenges. This gives us two essential endorsements, a set of rules and a clear order of conduct. From those emerged crucial element of post-war international relations, predictability. Without predictability, without rules, and without order, global affairs would descend into the chaos. This is why today, as we hear discussion about potential negotiation to the Russia-Ukraine war, we must reaffirm a fundamental principle. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And as the wind of change holds through Europe's security corridors, we say with equal resolve, nothing about Europe's security without Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Mr. Thomas Porte from France. And he will be followed by Mr. Levan Makashvili from Georgia.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, chers collègues. La sécurité de l'Europe ne peut se résumer à la défense armée. Cette semaine en France, au moment où se tenait le sommet élyséen sur la sécurité en Europe, se passait en plein jour et au cœur de Paris une attaque menée par un commando néo-nazi. 30 militants d'extrême droite, cagoulés, armés de couteaux sont venus s'attaquer à la projection d'un film antifasciste avec la volonté de faire mal et de tuer. 2 militants ont été blessés, l'un d'entre eux a dû même être transféré à l'hôpital. Une attaque commise au cri de Paris est nazi. L'extrême droite est aujourd'hui la grande menace ignorée de l'Europe. Le dernier indice mondial de l'ONU a enregistré une hausse du terrorisme d'extrême droite de 320%. Depuis 2011, les arrestations liées à l'ultra-droite et à l'extrême droite sont en nette augmentation. De Trump à Milei, en passant par Orban, Netanyahou et Meloni, l'international de l'extrême droite s'organise pour faire avancer son agenda réactionnaire. Partout, les groupuscules d'extrême droite violents se structurent et passent à l'action, surfant sur un climat raciste, islamophobe et anti-migrant, encouragé par une large partie de la classe médiatique et politique. Au moment où nous parlons, Maya, une militante antifasciste, est présentée à la justice hongroise comme une terroriste, pieds et mains enchaînés. En France, Gino, un militant, est lui pourchassé par Orban pour avoir participé à une manifestation contre un rassemblement nazi. La répression s'accélère partout contre les voix qui luttent contre l'extrême droite. Face à cela, la grande coalition contre l'international fasciste. Collègues, l'ombre fasciste n'est plus aux portes de l'Europe. Elle gangrène déjà l'Europe et le monde. Elle détruit méthodiquement le cadre dans lequel nous nous sommes retrouvés aujourd'hui, une vision d'une humanité partagée sans distinction de race. L'OSCE se doit d'ériger la lutte contre l'extrême droite en priorité.
Thank you, Mr. Porte. And I must announce that there will be no interpretation after this. And the next speaker will be Mr. Levan Makashvili from Georgia, and he will be followed by Mr. Yaroslav Yursichin from Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Drawing from our own experiences of past 3 conflicts with Russia in the 1990s and 2008, as well as ongoing Russian occupation of Georgia's 2 historic regions, we understood that the only way to survive this once-in-a-lifetime geopolitical earthquake was to set aside emotions and to act pragmatically. Over the past 3 years, Georgia made difficult yet necessary decisions based on clear-eyed analysis of the magnitude of threats to ensure peace and preserve our statehood. While we were called all sorts of labels by some hot minds, all we were doing was indeed to survive. and the ongoing developments on Russia's aggression against Ukraine indicates to only one thing: we made right decisions. For small states like Georgia and many of you in this room, the path forward in this ever-changing geopolitical landscape requires both caution and unity. We must navigate these turbulent times by supporting one another, not undermining each other by illegal foreign interference and disinformation that we heard today in this room too. It is only through solidarity and through respecting each other's democratic cultures and currents that we can shield our societies from the destabilizing effects of external interference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Makashvili. And the next speaker is Mr. Yaroslav Yursichin from Ukraine, and he will be followed by Ms. Maya Bitache from Georgia.
Dear colleagues, thanks for your stress that Ukrainian war is not only about Ukraine and Russia, it's about diplomacy, about the democracy. Evil are united because Northern Korean soldiers, Iranian drones, and China technologies in Ukraine. So democracy must be united because not punished, we will return with more forces. And the last half a minute, I used to be a voice of silent people, indigenous nation in Russia Federation, because 19th of September this year, previous year, the last Kyrgyz nation representative, Ivan Taymarov, was killed in this war, and we can lose not even people but nation. So I hope we will have possibility to invite representative of indigenous people from Russia to this tribune, how we invite Vladimir Kara-Murza. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Yursichin. The next speaker is Ms. Maya Bitache from Georgia, and she will be followed by Mr. Jurgis Klotins from Latvia.
Chair, esteemed colleagues, it's a privilege to speak before you today, not just a representative of Georgia, but as a defender of democracy and our shared European values. The 2024 elections in Georgia were a defining moment, a moment where democracy stood strong. We welcome the OSCE and other international organizations to observe the elections. Despite challenges, the observation report highlights that the election process in Georgia featured efficient election administration, including the use of new technologies. Election day was well organized and administered. Contestants were able to campaign freely. The voters were offered a wide choice of 80 parties to choose from. The media landscape was diverse, and unprecedentedly high number of observers observed the elections. Yes, despite this, some forces seek to distort the reality, undermining not just Georgia democracy, but the OSCE itself. Some accusations of Russian interference with no evidence and baseless claims risk becoming politically motivated disinformation. This is unjust, particularly for a country like Georgia, where 20% of our territory remains under Russian occupation. It is deeply concerning that Mr. Wilson's remarks today closely mirror the narrative of Georgian radical opposition, almost as if they were written by the same hand. This is the very opposition that surrendered Georgian territories to Russia and governed through authoritarian means, disregarding human rights and property rights, violations confirmed by the European Court of Human Rights. I can't help but ask, where were these voices when we were on the ground resisting Russian aggression? Why did they remain silent when Georgians suffered under the United Nations movement rule? Let me be clear, no amount of misinformation can erase the will of Georgian people. Their voices must be heard and their sovereignty must be respected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bitache. The next speaker is Mr. Jurgis Klotins from Latvia, and he will be followed by Mr. Kemal Celik from Turkey.
Madam President, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in Helsinki, the summer 1973, the preparatory conference for Helsinki Final Act took place. At the reception, Latvian exile resistance leader Mr. Uldis Grava went up to the foreign minister of Soviet Russia, aggressor and occupier of Baltic countries, and said to him, "The Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians have never given up their freedom and their right to determine their own destiny." Uldis Grava action reminds us courage that free Europe, its nations and leaders needs in our time to stand for what is true and just, to stand with Ukraine and reaffirm that peace cannot be established without respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and without security guarantees. and to meet decisions needed regarding security and transatlantic partnership. It means for EU and NATO countries to increase defense spending to 3.5% of GDP and to 5% in countries bordering with aggressor Russia. It is Europe's contribution to transatlantic cooperation with the US and Canada, and this cooperation is vital to uphold rules-based international order in our common Western civilization and also globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Klotins. And the next speaker is Mr. Kemal Çelik from Turkey, and he will be followed by Mr. Fatmir Mediu from Albania.
Teşekkür ederim Sayın Başkan. Nükleer tehditlerin, savaşların sebebi silah sanayine sahip ülkeler olduğu çok açıktır. Sorunu başka yerde aramayalım. Silah sanayine sahip ülkeler, savaşı, çatışmayı başlatanlar şimdi sorunun çözümü ve barış için rol almaya başlıyorlar. Çözüm önerileri de Gazze'lileri sürgüne göndermek, barışa karşılık Ukrayna'nın madenlerini işletmek. Değerli Başkan, Filistin ve Ukrayna güvende değilse Avrupa'da güvende değildir. Güvenlik sadece belli sınırlar içinde düşünülemez. Tüm dünya güvenlik içerisinde değilse Avrupa güvenliğinden bahsedemeyiz. Filistin'in güvensizliği, acıları üstüne kimse kendisi için güven ortamı kuramaz. Siber güvenlik ve nükleer tehditlerin var olduğu bir dünyada Agitpa'nın varoluş felsefesi olan güvenlik küresel olarak ele alınmalıdır. Bu çerçevede Agitpa Avrupa güvenliğinin ötesinde Dünya Güvenlik Örgütü'ne evrilme zamanının geldiğine inanıyorum. Aksi takdirde fonksiyonel olamayız. Şimdi olduğu gibi toplanıp evimize geri döneriz. Teşekkürler.
Thank you. And the next speaker on our list is Mr. Fatmir Mediu from Albania, and that he will be followed by Mr. Sevin Svatalieva from Azerbaijan, and that will also conclude the list. Mr. Fatmir Mediu, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Russia is the primary existential threat, imminent threat, and the results of the peace talks about Ukraine will have a long effect in Europe, but also in some very parts of Europe, like the Balkans, where Russia has been trying to destabilize through their proxy actors and governments in the region. But I heard my colleagues talking about threat or problems with US, but I hope I'm wrong, but I haven't heard anyone speaking about another threat, which is the biggest one is going to be for a long time, which is China. So we are talking about security of Europe. The question is that China is exploiting economic investment in infrastructure and technology to influence and shift the geopolitics in Europe and also in the world. And China companies are possessing threats also to our privacy, the privacy of our citizens. So as I don't have too much time, these are my conclusions. Expand NATO defense, deterrence, foster intelligence coordination, eliminate Russian and Chinese economic leverage through strategic investments, energy independence, shut down malign influence operation in media and politics and cyber, accelerate NATO and EU integration of vulnerable states in the Balkans.
Thank you, Mr. Mediu. And now we have come to the last speaker on my list, who is Mr. Sevin Svatalieva from Azerbaijan. You have the floor.
Madam President, I think there is a technical error. Ms. Madam Fatalieva already spoke.
All right. So in that case, we have concluded our debate, and the standing committee will meet in this room at 2 o'clock. Thank you all.